Welcome to our journey into the history of antiquity. Before we begin, I have a question for you. Which ancient culture do you find most exciting? Egypt, Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia, or a completely different one? Write your answer in the comments. I'm curious to see which high culture fascinates you the most. In this series, we'll look at how the first major cities came into being, why pyramids were built, how democracy began in Greece, how Rome became a world power, and why antiquity continues to influence our world today. If you're interested in history and don't want to miss any more episodes, subscribe to the channel. And if you like this video, I'd be happy to receive a like. This will support this series and help even more people get interested in history. And now we travel back to a time full of powerful empires, great ideas, famous rulers, and decisive turning points: antiquity. Chapter 1. What does antiquity mean? When we talk about antiquity today, many people first think of pyramids, Greek temples, Roman legionnaires, philosophers in white robes, or huge amphitheaters. Antiquity often seems to us like a distant, almost legendary world. And yet it is much closer to our present than it seems at first glance. Many ideas, terms, and structures that shape our lives to this day have their roots in this era. Democracy, republic, philosophy, law, science, urban planning, administration, literature, theater, and even many forms of political power. But what does antiquity actually mean exactly? The term antiquity comes from the Latin word antiquus, which means old or formerly. This refers to a long historical epoch, which mainly includes the cultures of the Mediterranean region and the Middle East. Ancient Greece and the Roman Empire are particularly well known. But the history of antiquity does not begin with Athens or Rome. It goes back further, to the early advanced civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt, i.e. in regions where people built cities, developed writings, and organized powerful states thousands of years before the Greeks and Romans. In terms of time, antiquity cannot be started or ended with a single clear date. History rarely works like a light switch that is suddenly flipped. Epochs emerge slowly, overlap, and change differently depending on the region. Nevertheless, you need points of orientation. The history of antiquity often begins around the 4th millennium BC, when the first great advanced civilizations emerged in Mesopotamia and Egypt. During this time, people developed a script, built cities, organized irrigation systems, and created the first states with rulers, officials, priests, and soldiers. The end of antiquity is often associated with the year 476 AD. In that year, the last Western Roman emperor was deposed. The Western Roman Empire, which had once ruled large parts of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, thus ceased to exist as a political power. But here, too, antiquity did not end everywhere at the same time. In the East, the Roman Empire continued to exist for almost 1,000 years in the form of the Byzantine Empire. Many historians therefore speak of late antiquity, a transitional period between classical antiquity and the Middle Ages. During this phase, religion, politics, society, and culture changed fundamentally. Antiquity is therefore not a short period of time. It spans several millennia. During this long time, empires arose that perished again. Cities were founded and destroyed. Religions changed. Peoples migrated. Wars were fought. Trade routes were created, and again people developed new ideas about how a state should function, what justice means, or how to explain the world. Geographically, antiquity was mainly anchored in the Mediterranean region and the Middle East. These include regions such as Mesopotamia, the area between the Euphrates and the Tigris, today's Egypt on the Nile, Asia Minor, the Levant, Persia, Greece, Italy, North Africa, and later large parts of Europe. The Mediterranean played a central role in this. It was not just a border between countries, but a connection. Goods were transported across the sea, ideas were spread, colonies were founded, and wars were fought. Those who controlled the Mediterranean often also controlled trade, wealth, and political power. An important peculiarity of antiquity is the emergence of complex societies. People no longer lived only in small villages. but in cities with several thousand or even hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. There were craftsmen, merchants, scribes, soldiers, priests, officials, and rulers. The work was divided. Not everyone had to make their own food. Some people could specialize in administration, religion, art, science, or the military. This gave rise to new professions, new social differences, and new forms of power. With the cities also came the need to organize coexistence. Who distributes the water? Who sets laws? Who decides on war and peace? Who collects taxes? Who protects the city from enemies? Such questions led to the development of systems of rule. In Egypt, the pharaohs ruled as godlike kings. In Mesopotamia, city-states and empires emerged. In Greece, the polis developed, i.e., the city-state in which citizens could have a say in politics. In Rome, first a republic emerged, later an empire. Antiquity is therefore also the history of political experiments. It is particularly exciting that people during this time found very different answers to the question of how power should be organized. An early form of democracy emerged in Athens. However, this did not mean that all people were allowed to have a say. Women, slaves, and strangers were excluded. Nevertheless, the idea that citizens could discuss and vote together on political decisions was revolutionary. In Sparta, on the other hand, the military order was the focus. Rome, in turn, developed a republic with a senate, magistrates, and popular assemblies before this republic became an empire. In addition to politics, religion played an enormous role. In almost all ancient cultures, people believed in many gods. These gods were responsible for natural forces, cities, professions, fertility, war, love, or fate. Religion was not only a private matter, but closely linked to the state and society. Temples were economic and political centers. Priests had great influence. Rulers often justified their power religiously. In Egypt, the pharaoh was considered divine or at least a mediator between gods and humans. In Rome, emperors were later even venerated themselves. At the same time, a new way of thinking about the world arose in antiquity. Especially in Greece, philosophers began to ask questions that are still important today. What is truth? What is justice? What is a good life? How should a state be structured? What is the human being? Philosophers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle shaped the thinking of Europe for centuries. Ancient scholars also made important progress in mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and nature observation. They tried to explain natural phenomena not only through myths, but also through observation and reason. Another central aspect of antiquity is writing. Without writing, we could know much less about this time today. The Sumerians developed cuneiform, the Egyptians hieroglyphics, and later alphabet scripts emerged that were easier to learn and pass on. Writing made administration possible. You could document taxes, record laws, conclude treaties, preserve religious texts, and record historical events. Through writing, memory became more durable. It was one of the most important prerequisites for large states and complex cultures. But antiquity was not only a time of great ideas and impressive buildings. It was also a time of hard inequality. Many societies were based on slavery. Wars were frequent. Conquered peoples were exploited. In most cultures, women had significantly fewer rights than men. Political participation was often reserved for only a small group. Therefore, when we look at antiquity, we should neither romanticize it nor merely admire it. It was an era full of achievements, but also full of violence, oppression, and social differences. So why is antiquity still important today? Because many foundations of our world today were created or decisively shaped there. Democracy has its early roots in Athens. Roman law influences modern legal systems. Many European languages contain Latin and Greek terms. In architecture, literature, philosophy, politics, and art, people still refer to ancient models today. Even terms such as Senate, Republic, Emperor, philosophy, theater, or Olympic Games lead directly back to antiquity. The history of antiquity is therefore more than a glimpse into a distant past. It is also a look at the origins of many questions that still occupy us. How does power come about? Who is allowed to have a say? How do you organize a society? What makes a culture successful? Why do the rich go under? And what remains of them? In the next chapters, we will travel step by step through this fascinating epoch. We start with the first advanced civilizations in the Middle East, look at ancient Egypt, follow the Greeks from their early palaces to the democracy of Athens, accompany Alexander the Great on his campaigns, and finally experience the rise of Rome from a small city on the Tiber to a world power. Antiquity is a history of inventions, wars, rulers, thinkers, cities, and empires. Above all, however, it is a story of people who tried to understand, order, and shape their world. And that's exactly why it's worth getting to know this time in more detail. Chapter 2: The First Advanced Civilizations in the Near East. If we really want to understand the history of antiquity, we don't have to start our journey in Greece or Rome, but much further east. We have to look at a region that is often referred to as one of the cradles of civilization, the Middle East. Here, between large rivers, fertile plains, and old trade routes, some of the first advanced civilizations in human history emerged. Mesopotamia, the area between the rivers Euphrates and Tigris, was particularly important. The name comes from the Greek and means land between the rivers. Today, this area is mainly in Iraq, but parts of Syria and Turkey are also part of it. In ancient times, Mesopotamia was not a unified nation, but a space in which different peoples, cities, and empires arose over the millennia. The Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, among others, lived here. They all had a decisive influence on the early history of antiquity. The reason why this region in particular has become so important is mainly due to its landscape. The Euphrates and Tigris brought water to an area that would have been dry and difficult to cultivate in many places without irrigation. People learned to build canals, irrigate fields, and control the water of the rivers. This allowed them to produce more food than they needed immediately to survive. This surplus was a crucial prerequisite for the emergence of cities. Because as long as almost all people are busy procuring food, there is little time for other activities. But if there are enough grains, dates, vegetables, and livestock, some people can specialize in other tasks. Some become craftsmen, others merchants, scribes, priests, soldiers, or civil servants. It was precisely this change that was one of the most important steps on the way to high culture. A high culture can be recognized not only by large buildings, but also by the division of labor, administration, writing, religion, trade, cities, and a political order. The Sumerians are considered one of the earliest advanced civilizations in Mesopotamia. As early as the 4th millennium BC, important cities such as Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Eridu were built in southern Mesopotamia. These cities were more than just large settlements. They were political, religious, and economic centers. Each city had its own rulers, its own temples, and often its own protective deity. This is why we speak of city-states. A city-state consisted of a city and the surrounding land controlled by that city. At the center of many Sumerian cities stood the temple. Particularly striking were the so-called ziggurats, large step temple buildings that looked like artificial mountains. They were supposed to symbolize proximity to the gods. Religion played a central role in Mesopotamia. People believed in many gods who were responsible for natural forces, cities, and areas of life. Since floods, droughts, and wars could threaten life at any time, attempts were made to appease the gods through sacrifices, prayers, and rituals. The priests had great influence as a result. They managed temple property, organized supplies, and played an important role in the distribution of food and goods. Over time, however, secular rulers also gained more and more power. These kings waged wars, built city walls, organized work assignments, and ensured order. In the early city-states, religion, economics, and politics were closely linked. One of the greatest achievements of Mesopotamia was the invention of writing. The Sumerians developed cuneiform writing. Initially, it served mainly practical purposes. They wanted to record how many sacks of grain were delivered, how many animals belonged to a temple, or what goods were traded. The characters were pressed into damp clay with a stylus. Then the clay tablets were dried or fired. Many of these panels have survived to this day and give us a direct insight into the lives of the people of that time. Over time, simple administrative characters developed into a complex writing system. Now you could not only write down numbers and goods, but also record laws, myths, prayers, letters, and stories. One of the most famous works from Mesopotamia is the Epic of Gilgamesh. It tells of King Gilgamesh of Uruk, of friendship, power, loss, and the search for immortality. This makes it one of the oldest literary works in the world. Writing fundamentally changed society. Those who could read and write had access to knowledge and administration. Scribes, therefore, became an important professional group. They had to be trained for a long time and worked for temples, palaces, or merchants. Without Schreiber, the administration of large cities and empires would hardly have been possible. They recorded taxes, documented contracts, noted laws, and preserved religious texts. But Mesopotamia was not only a land of cities and writers, but also a space of constant competition. The city-states fought for water, land, trade routes, and influence. Since rivers were vital, control of irrigation systems could make the difference between prosperity and hardship. Wars between cities were frequent. Over time, larger empires emerged from these conflicts. An important step was the kingdom of the Akkadians. Around 2300 BC, Sargon of Akkad succeeded in conquering several Sumerian city-states and building a larger empire. Sargon is considered one of the first rulers in world history to create an empire, i.e., an empire that united many different cities and regions under one central rule. The Akkadian Empire was not permanently stable, but it showed that power could now be organized beyond individual city-states. Later, Babylon became one of the most important centers of Mesopotamia. King Hammurabi, who ruled in the 18th century BC, is particularly famous. Its name is primarily associated with one of the most famous collections of laws of antiquity, the Codex Hammurabi. This collection contained numerous rules on property, trade, family, bodily harm, work, and punishment. The Codex shows how important written laws have become for a complex society. But it also shows that society was strongly hierarchical. Penalties could vary depending on social rank. Babylon was not only politically, but also culturally significant. The city later became a symbol of greatness, wealth, and power. Especially under Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BC, Babylon experienced a new heyday. The city was famous for its walls, temples, and magnificent buildings. Even though some reports were embellished later, Babylon still stands for the tremendous cultural power of Mesopotamia. In the north of Mesopotamia, the Assyrian Empire emerged. The Assyrians were particularly known for their military strength. They built up a powerful army, used siege techniques, and often acted brutally against defeated opponents. Their empire reached an enormous extent in the first millennium BC. Assyrian kings understood rule as a sign of divine support and had their victories depicted on reliefs and inscriptions. At the same time, the Assyrians were not only warriors. They built large cities like Nineveh and gathered knowledge. The library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal contained thousands of clay tablets with literary, scientific, and religious texts. The history of Mesopotamia shows how many foundations of later civilizations were created very early on. Here people developed writing, administration, collections of laws, urban planning, organized religion, long-distance trade, and complex systems of rule. Mathematics and astronomy also played an important role. The people of Mesopotamia observed the sky, calculated periods of time, and developed number systems. Our division of the hour into 60 minutes and the minute into 60 seconds today ultimately goes back to Mesopotamian traditions. Of course, life in these early advanced civilizations was not the same for all people. At the top were kings, priests and high officials. Merchants, craftsmen, farmers and simple workers lived underneath. Slavery also existed. Many people had to do hard physical work, for example in the construction of canals, city walls, or temples. Women could take on different roles depending on time, place, and social status, but were usually legally and socially subordinate to men. Nevertheless, the performance of these early societies remains impressive. They created structures without which later empires would have been hard to imagine. They invented methods to organize large amounts of people, goods, and information. They built cities in which religion, trade, administration, and power came together. And they left behind texts that still tell us something about their worries, hopes, and ideas today. Mesopotamia was thus a decisive starting point in ancient history. People didn't just live, build, and fight here. This is where many of the foundations of what we call civilization originated: writing, city, state, law, and administration. The people between the Euphrates and Tigris faced challenges that still seem familiar to us today. How do you distribute water fairly? How do you organize work? How do you keep order in a large society? How do you justify power? And how do you preserve knowledge for future generations? In the next chapter, we turn to another great advanced civilization that emerged almost simultaneously with Mesopotamia and yet went its own way: ancient Egypt. There, another large river determined the lives of the people, the Nile. Chapter 3: Ancient Egypt. When we think of antiquity, ancient Egypt is one of the first images that arise in our mind's eye. Huge pyramids rise out of the desert, mysterious hieroglyphics cover temple walls, pharaohs rule over a mighty empire, and the Nile flows through the land like a lifeline. Hardly any other ancient culture fascinates people as much as Egypt today. But behind the impressive buildings and the golden masks hides a long and complex history. Ancient Egypt was not only a land of monuments, but a highly developed society with administration, religion, agriculture, art, science, and political order. The basis of this culture was the Nile. Without this river, ancient Egypt would not have existed in this form. Egypt is located in an arid region surrounded by deserts. Rain rarely falls there. But the Nile brought water, fertile mud, and thus life. Every year the river overflowed its banks and flooded the fields. When the water receded, a dark, nutrient-rich soil remained. Farmers could grow grain, vegetables, and flax on it. The Nile turned a narrow strip of land into one of the most fertile regions of the ancient world. That is why the Greek historian Herodotus later described Egypt as a gift from the Nile. This formulation shows how much the country was dependent on the river. The Nile was not only important for agriculture, it was also the most important transport route. Boats transported people, goods, building materials, and messages. Since the river flows from south to north, it was possible to travel northwards with the current. In the other direction, the wind helped, which often came from the north and drove sailing ships upstream. Thus, the Nile connected Upper Egypt in the south with Lower Egypt in the north. The history of ancient Egypt does not suddenly begin with the pyramids. Long before that, people lived on the Nile, farmed and founded settlements. Around 3000 BC, Upper and Lower Egypt were united into one empire. This association is considered one of the most important starting points in Egyptian history. The ruler of this unified empire was later referred to as Pharaoh. He was at the head of the state and was considered not only a political ruler, but also a religious figure. In the imagination of the Egyptians, the pharaoh made sure that the divine order on earth was preserved. The Egyptians called this order Marat. Marat meant truth, justice, harmony, and cosmic order. The world should not sink into chaos. The pharaoh had the task of preserving Marat. He had to honor the gods, protect the land, administer justice, and ensure prosperity. This gave his rule a religious foundation. Whoever served the pharaoh did not simply serve a king, but an order that encompassed the whole of life. Egyptian society was strictly structured. At the head was the pharaoh and his family. Among them followed high officials, priests, and military leaders. The scribes played a particularly important role. They were proficient in hieroglyphics and other forms of writing, and were responsible for administration, tax lists, record-keeping, contracts, and religious texts. Those who could write had access to power and influence. Most people, however, were farmers. They worked in the fields, paid taxes, and performed labor services for the state. In addition, there were craftsmen, traders, soldiers, workers, and also slaves. The Egyptian script is one of the most famous writing systems in the world. The hieroglyphics consisted of signs that could represent people, animals, plants, objects, or sounds. They were mainly used for religious and monumental texts, such as on temple walls, grave inscriptions, or statues. For everyday life, scribes used simplified forms of writing that could be written more quickly on papyrus. Papyrus was made from a plant that grew on the Nile and was one of the most important writing materials of antiquity. One of the most striking achievements of ancient Egypt was its architecture. The pyramids of the Old Kingdom are particularly famous. They were created as tombs for pharaohs and were intended to ensure their continued life in the afterlife. The largest and most famous is the Pyramid of Cheops of Giza. Its construction shows how well the Egyptian state was able to organize people, materials, and work. It took planning, mathematical knowledge, administration, and an enormous number of workers. For a long time, it was imagined that the pyramids had been built exclusively by slaves. Today, it is more likely that many workers were farmers who were temporarily employed for state construction projects, especially in times when there was less work in the fields. The pyramids were not just tombs, but an expression of a religious idea. The Egyptians believed in life after death. Death was not the end for them, but a transition. In order for a person to continue to exist in the afterlife, body, name, and memory had to be preserved. That is why the Egyptians developed mummification. The body was treated carefully so that it did not decompose. Graves were equipped with food, jewelry, tools, furniture, and religious texts. Particularly powerful people were given magnificent tombs, because their life in the afterlife was supposed to correspond to their rank. Religion was omnipresent in ancient Egypt. The Egyptians believed in many gods. Among the most important were Re, the sun god, Osiris, the god of the afterlife, Isis, the goddess of magic and motherhood, Horus, the sky god, and Anubis, who was associated with mummification and the cult of the dead. Gods could have human form, animal form, or a mixture of both. Temples were places where the gods were worshipped. But they were also economic centers with land ownership, supplies, and personnel. Priests performed rituals, cared for the images of the gods, and ensured that the relationship between humans and the divine world was preserved. The history of Egypt is often divided into several major periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. In between there were so-called intermediate periods in which the central power weakened. In the Old Kingdom, the Great Pyramids were built. In the Middle Kingdom, the state was reorganized and culturally developed. In the New Kingdom, Egypt achieved its greatest power. During this time, famous pharaohs such as Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Ramses II ruled. Hatshepsut was one of the few women who ruled as pharaoh. In the official presentation, she often presented herself with male symbols of power in order to legitimize her position. Her reign was marked by construction projects and trade. Akhenaten later attempted a religious reform. He focused on the sun god Aten and weakened the importance of other gods. However, this change was not permanent. After his death, Egypt largely returned to the old religious order. Tutankhamun became famous above all for the discovery of his almost intact tomb in 1922. Ramses II, on the other hand, is considered one of the most powerful and well-known pharaohs of the New Kingdom. He had huge temples built and waged wars. including against the Hittites. But Egypt was not always strong and stable either. The empire experienced crises, power struggles, foreign domination, and economic problems. Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans influenced or ruled Egypt at various times. The conquest by Alexander the Great in 332 BC was particularly drastic. After that, the Greek Macedonian dynasty of the Ptolemies ruled. The last known ruler of this dynasty was Cleopatra VII. After their defeat by Rome, Egypt became a Roman province in 30 BC. Despite these changes, Egyptian culture remained surprisingly stable for thousands of years. Their art, their religious ideas, and their symbols of power have changed, but they have retained many basic forms. It is precisely this long continuity that makes Egypt so special. While many empires in Mesopotamia followed one another quickly, Egypt developed a strong cultural self-image over a very long time. Ancient Egypt left a unique legacy to the world. His pyramids, temples, statues, texts, and tombs tell of a society that took death as seriously as life, that closely linked nature and religion and made the power of the state visible in monumental form. But Egypt was not only a world of pharaohs. It was also a world of farmers, scribes, artisans, priests, merchants, and workers who collectively created one of the most enduring cultures in history. When we look at ancient Egypt, we recognize a central truth of antiquity. Great cultures emerge where people learn to use their environment, organize their coexistence, and develop shared ideas of order, power, and meaning. In Egypt, the Nile combined all these elements. It gave nourishment, structure, direction, and identity. That's why it was more than a river. It was the lifeline of an entire civilization. Chapter 4: The Ancient Empires of the Near East. While Mesopotamia and Egypt were among the earliest advanced civilizations of antiquity, other powerful empires emerged in the Middle East over the centuries. They were located between Anatolia, Mesopotamia, Syria, Persia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. This region was a kind of hub of the ancient world. This is where trade routes crossed, where different cultures met, and where great powers fought for influence, raw materials, cities, and strategically important areas. The Middle East was not a peripheral area of antiquity, but one of its most important centers. Whoever controlled this region had access to trade routes, fertile landscapes, metals, horses, timber, and important cities. As a result, empires were created here again and again, reaching far beyond their original core areas. Among the most important were the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians, and especially the Persians. They all contributed to the development of ever larger political entities from early city-states. An early empire of this region was the Empire of the Hittites. It originated in Anatolia, i.e. in the area of today's Turkey. The capital of the Hittites was called Hattusha and was located in central Anatolia. From there, the Hittite kings built up a powerful empire from the 2nd millennium BC. The Hittites were particularly adept at uniting different peoples and regions under their rule. They adopted influences from Mesopotamia, Syria, and Anatolia and developed their own culture from them. An important basis of their power was the military. The Hittites used chariots, which played a crucial role on the battlefield in the Bronze Age. Chariots were fast, agile, and could disrupt enemy lines. In addition, the Hittites had good knowledge of metalworking. They are often attributed a special role in the use of iron, even if iron was initially rare and precious. Crucially, the Hittites were part of a world in which technical skills, military organization, and political alliances could determine the survival of an empire. The Hittites became particularly famous for their conflict with Egypt. In the 13th century BC, the Hittites and the Egyptians under Ramses II faced each other in the Battle of Kadesh. Both sides claimed influence in Syria, a strategically important area between the great powers. The battle itself did not end in an unequivocal victory, but it later led to one of the earliest known peace treaties in history. This treaty between Egypt and the Hittites shows that ancient politics was not just war. Diplomacy, marriage alliances and treaties were also important means of power. But like many empires of the Bronze Age, the Hittite Empire fell into a serious crisis around 1200 BC. During this time, several states in the eastern Mediterranean collapsed. Trade networks were disrupted, cities destroyed, populations were set in motion. The exact causes are still not fully understood. There were probably several factors at work: internal conflicts, climate change, economic problems, attacks by foreign groups, and the collapse of international trade relations. The great empire of the Hittites disappeared, but smaller Hittite successor states continued to exist for a while. After the end of the Bronze Age, other powers came to the fore. The Assyrians in particular became one of the most feared great powers of antiquity. Its core area was in the north of Mesopotamia, on the upper Tigris. Cities such as Assyria, Nimrud, and Nineveh became centers of Assyrian power. Although the Assyrians had played an important role before, in the first millennium BC they established a huge empire that at times stretched from Mesopotamia to Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. The Assyrians were best known for their military strength. Their army was well organized and had infantry, cavalry, chariots, siege engines, and technical specialists. They could attack fortified cities, destroy walls, and carry out long campaigns. Their kings presented themselves as powerful warriors who acted on behalf of the gods. They had victories, hunts, sieges, and punitive actions recorded on reliefs and inscriptions. These depictions were intended to impress and deter. Assyrian rule, however, was not based solely on violence. The Reich needed a functioning administration. Conquered territories were divided into provinces, governors were appointed, tributes were levied, and roads were used to move messages and troops quickly. The Assyrians developed a system that allowed them to control large spaces. This also included the resettlement of population groups. Defeated peoples were sometimes taken away from their homeland and settled in other parts of the empire. This was supposed to prevent riots and distribute workers. For those affected, however, it meant great suffering and the loss of their homeland. Despite their brutality, the Assyrians were also preservers and promoters of culture. The library of King Ashurbanipal in Nineveh is particularly famous. Thousands of clay tablets were collected there, including religious texts, omen literature, medical texts, word lists, and literary works such as the Epic of Gilgamesh. This collection is invaluable for modern research because it has handed down many texts that would otherwise have been lost. But even the mighty Assyrian Empire was not invincible. Its harshness generated resistance. Subjugated peoples used every weakness to rebel. Eventually, Babylonians and Medes allied against Assyria. In the late 7th century BC, the Assyrian centers were destroyed, including Nineveh. This ended Assyrian domination in the Middle East. Assyria was replaced for a short time by the Neo-Babylonian Empire. King Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned in the 6th century BC, is particularly well known. Under him, Babylon became one of the most magnificent cities in the ancient world. The city impressed with walls, gates, temples, and processional roads. The famous Ishtar Gate, with its glazed bricks and animal representations, shows Babylon's artistic and political self-portrayal to this day. Nebuchadnezzar II also led campaigns to the west. The conquest of Jerusalem in 587 or 586 BC was particularly significant. The temple was destroyed, and parts of the Jewish upper class were deported to Babylon. This event is known as the Babylonian exile and had enormous significance for Jewish history and religion. It shows how closely political events and religious developments were linked in antiquity. But the Neo-Babylonian Empire did not last long. As early as 539 BC, Babylon was conquered by the Persian king Cyrus II. This marked the beginning of the rise of an empire that was to surpass all previous empires in the Middle East, the Persian Empire of the Achaemenids. The Persians originally came from the area of today's Iran. Under Cyrus II, also known as Cyrus the Great, a huge empire arose in the 6th century BC. Cyrus defeated the Medes, conquered Lydia in Asia Minor and finally Babylon. His successors continued to expand the empire. Under Darius I, the Persian Empire stretched from Egypt to India, from Asia Minor to Central Asia. It was one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. The special strength of the Persians lay not only in conquest, but also in administration. An empire of this size could not be held together by force alone. The Persians divided their territory into administrative districts, so-called satrapies. At their head were satraps, i.e. royal governors. They had to collect taxes, ensure order and remain loyal to the great king. At the same time, Persian rule left many subjugated peoples their religions, languages, and local traditions. This relative tolerance helped to keep the empire stable. Darius I had roads expanded, including the famous King's Road, which connected important parts of the empire. A well-organized messaging system ensured that orders and information could be passed on quickly. In addition, administration was standardized, coinage was promoted, and royal authority was made visible through inscriptions, palaces, and ceremonies. The Persian kings presented themselves as rulers over many peoples, appointed by divine support and responsible for order in the empire. The Persian Empire was multicultural. Egyptians, Babylonians, Jews, Greeks, Phoenicians, Medes, Persians, and many other groups lived in it. It was precisely this diversity that made the empire rich and powerful, but also difficult to control. Again and again there were uprisings. The Greek cities of Asia Minor in particular played an important role in the conflicts between Persia and the Greek world. These tensions later developed into the Persian Wars, which became decisive for the history of Greece. The empires of the Middle East show us that antiquity was not just made up of individual cultures, but of a dense network of relationships. War, trade, diplomacy, migration, and cultural exchange linked Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Syria, Persia, and the Mediterranean region. Ideas, technologies, religious ideas, and forms of administration migrated from one region to another. Above all, however, these empires show how political power continued to expand. City-states became kingdoms. Kingdoms became empires. Rulers had to learn to administer large areas, to involve different peoples, and to make their power visible. The Hittites, Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians developed different strategies for this. Military strength, treaties, resettlements, administration, tolerance, road construction, and royal self-promotion. In doing so, they prepared the ground for later empires. Alexander the Great took over many structures of the Persian Empire after conquering it. Rome, too, learned from previous empires how to administer provinces, build roads, and organize power over long distances. The Middle East was therefore not only the scene of ancient history. It was a laboratory of domination in which many forms of statehood, administration, and imperial power were developed. In the next chapter, we look at the beginnings of the Greek world. There were no huge river empires as in Egypt or Mesopotamia, but many smaller communities, island cultures, and city-states. They developed into a culture whose influence on politics, art, philosophy, and science can still be felt today. Chapter 5: The Beginnings of the Greek World. When we think of ancient Greece, images of white temples, philosophers, theaters, Olympic Games, city-states, and the democracy of Athens immediately come to mind. But this famous Greek world did not come into being overnight. Before Athens, Sparta, or Corinth became well-known powers, there was a long history. It began on islands, on coasts, in palaces and small settlements. The beginnings of the Greek world take us to a time when myths, trade, war, and seafaring were closely linked. Greece was geographically very different from Egypt or Mesopotamia. There, large rivers such as the Nile, Euphrates, and Tigris had favored the emergence of central empires. Greece, on the other hand, consisted of mountains, valleys, islands, and long coasts. Large, contiguous levels were rare. Many communities lived separately from each other in small landscapes. This made it difficult to form a single large empire. At the same time, The sea opened the way for people to trade, exchange, and colonization. The Aegean Sea was not an insurmountable border, but a transport area that connected islands, coasts, and cultures. One of the earliest important cultures of this region originated in Crete, the Minoan culture. It is named after the legendary king Minos, whom we know from Greek myths. The story of the labyrinth and the Minotaur, a creature half human, half bull, is particularly famous. We do not know whether this king really existed. What is certain, however, is that a highly developed culture emerged on Crete from about the 3rd millennium BC, which had trade, crafts, art, and palace centers. The most famous center of the Minoan culture was Knossos. A large palace complex was built there with courtyards, storerooms, workshops, living quarters, and religious rooms. The palace was not only the residence of a ruler, but also an economic and administrative center. Goods were collected, stored, and distributed. Craftsmen produced ceramics, jewelry, textiles, and other products. Merchants brought goods across the sea to other regions of the Aegean Sea and beyond. The Minoan culture was strongly influenced by the sea. Crete was conveniently located between Greece, Egypt, Asia Minor, and the eastern Mediterranean. This allowed the Minoans to establish contacts with many other cultures. They adopted influences, but also developed their own forms. Their art features colorful frescoes, depictions of animals, plants, festivals, processions, and bull jumps. These images give the impression of a living, dynamic culture. Even if we have to be careful, art does not always show everyday life, but often ideal images or religious scenes. The Minoans also knew writing systems. The so-called Linear A script is particularly well known. It has not been fully deciphered to this day. Therefore, we know less about many political and religious details of the Minoan culture than we would like to know. But archaeological finds show that this culture was organized in a complex way. It had administration, trade, and specialized production. Around 1450 BC, the Minoan culture lost its importance. The causes are not fully understood. Natural disasters, earthquakes, the volcanic eruption on Thera, economic problems, and attacks from outside could have played a role. In Crete, Mycenaean Greeks eventually became influential. This brings us to the second important early culture of the Greek world, the Mycenaean culture. The Mycenaeans lived on the Greek mainland. Its main centers were Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes. Unlike the palaces of the Minoans, the Mycenaean centers often appeared more fortified. They were located on hills and surrounded by mighty walls. The later Greeks called these walls Cyclopean, because they believed that only gigantic cyclops could have moved such huge stone blocks. The Mycenaean culture developed from about the 16th century BC and reached its heyday between 1400 and 1200 BC. It was more warlike than the Minoan culture. In the tombs of Mycenae, weapons, gold masks, jewelry, and precious objects were found. These finds show a society with rich elites, rulers, and warriors. The palaces were centers of administration and business. From there, land, supplies, craftsmen, and taxes were organized. The Mycenaeans used a script that we now call Linear B. In contrast to Linear A, Linear B could be deciphered. It turned out to be an early form of Greek. This is particularly important because it shows that the Mycenaean culture actually belongs to the prehistory of the later Greek world. The Linear B boards mainly contain administrative information, lists of goods, animals, weapons, workers, and taxes. They don't tell big stories, but they do give insight into the organization of the palace economy. The Mycenaean world is also associated with the stories of the Trojan War. Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, tell of heroes such as Agamemnon, Achilles, Hector, and Odysseus. These texts were not recorded in writing until much later, probably in the 8th century BC. They contain mythical elements, acts of the gods, and poetic embellishments. Nevertheless, they could preserve memories of conflicts in the Late Bronze Age. The city of Troy was located in the northwest of Asia Minor on an important trade route. Archaeological finds show that there was indeed an important city there, which was destroyed and rebuilt several times. Around 1200 BC, there were severe upheavals in the eastern Mediterranean world. Many palace centers were destroyed or abandoned. The Mycenaean culture also collapsed. The reasons are still controversial today. There was probably not just one cause, but a combination of internal crises, earthquakes, migratory movements, attacks, economic problems, and the collapse of large trade networks. This period marked the end of the Bronze Age palace cultures of Greece. After the collapse of the Mycenaean world, a phase followed, which is often referred to as the Dark Ages. This term does not mean that nothing happened during this time. Above all, it means that we have fewer written sources. The palace administrations disappeared, and with them the use of the linear B script disappeared. Many settlements became smaller, long-distance trade declined, and the population declined in some regions. Society was organized more simply than before. But even in these centuries, important foundations of later Greek culture developed. Iron was increasingly used for tools and weapons. New forms of settlement emerged. People moved within the Aegean Sea and to the coasts of Asia Minor. There, Greeks founded new communities, especially in Ionia. This region would later become an important center of Greek culture, poetry, and philosophy. A decisive change took place from the 8th century BC. Greece entered a new phase called the Archaic period. The population grew, trade increased, new contacts were made, and writing returned. This time, the Greeks adopted an alphabet from the Phoenicians and adapted it to their language. This Greek alphabet was easier to learn than the ancient syllabaries and became the basis of many later alphabets, including Latin. With the return of writing, poetry, laws, and inscriptions were also recorded. During this time, the Homeric epics were recorded in writing, or at least put into a form that was later handed down. The Iliad and the Odyssey were more than entertainment for the Greeks. They conveyed ideas of honor, heroism, gods, fate, hospitality, and human behavior. They became a common cultural point of reference for the Greek world. At the same time, one of the most important political forms in Greek history emerged, the polis. A polis was a city-state, i.e. a community of a city and its surrounding area. It was not only a place, but also a political community. The citizens of a polis saw themselves as members of a common association with their own laws, cults, festivals, and institutions. Each polis had its own identity. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, or Miletus were not provinces of a Greek state, but independent political units. The creation of the polis had a lot to do with the geographical fragmentation of Greece. Mountains, islands, and valleys favored local communities. But the polis was more than a reaction to landscape. It was a new way of thinking about political coexistence. It was not a divine king that was automatically at the center, but the community of citizens. Of course, this did not mean equality for all. Women, slaves, and strangers were usually excluded. Nevertheless, a form of political participation emerged here that was to become decisive for the rest of history. The Greeks felt culturally connected despite their many city-states. They spoke related dialects, worshipped similar gods, told similar myths, and took part in common festivals. Particularly important were the Olympic Games, which are traditionally attested from 776 BC onwards. Athletes from different Greek polis competed against each other, and special religious protection was in place during the games. Such festivals strengthened the awareness of belonging to a common Greek world, even if the individual city-states often competed with each other politically. The beginnings of the Greek world thus show a long way, from the palaces of Crete to the castles of the Mycenaeans, from the collapse of the Bronze Age through the Dark Centuries to the emergence of the polis. Greece was not born as a unified empire. It grew out of many small communities connected by the sea, trade, myths, language, and religion. It is precisely this diversity that made the Greek world so dynamic. Different political models could emerge in the city-states. In one polis, a strict military order developed, In another an early democracy. In still others nobles, tyrants or oligarchies ruled. This competition and diversity gave rise to a culture that was to have an enormous impact in art, philosophy, science, and politics. In the next chapter, we will take a closer look at how these city-states functioned. Athens and Sparta in particular show two very different ways of organizing society and power. One polis became famous for democracy, debate, and naval power. The other for discipline, military, and order. Together, they show how different the Greek world could be. Chapter 6, Greece, Polis, Democracy, and Society. The Greek world of antiquity did not consist of a single state. There was no common Greek king, no unified government, and no capital from which all Greeks were ruled. Instead, Greece was divided into many individual city-states, which are called polis. A polis was more than just a city. It was a political community with its own territory, its own laws, its own festivals, its own sanctuaries, and its own idea of how coexistence should be organized. It is precisely this diversity that made Greek history so exciting. Each polis saw itself as independent. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, Miletus or Argos were therefore not cities within a great Greek empire, but independent states. They could trade with each other, form alliances, or wage war against each other. Sometimes they felt part of a common Greek culture, especially when it came to external enemies. But in everyday life, her own interests were in the foreground. The Greeks shared language, myths, gods, and festivals, but politically they were highly fragmented. Greece's geographical conditions favored this development. Mountains, islands, valleys, and coasts separated many regions from each other. Large contiguous plains were rare. This created local communities that developed independently. At the same time, the sea connected the Greek cities with each other. The Aegean Sea was an area of trade, seafaring, and exchange. This created a world that on the one hand consisted of many small political units, but on the other hand was culturally closely connected. At the heart of each polis was the community of citizens. That sounds modern at first, but you have to be careful. Citizens in ancient Greece were not just all inhabitants. As a rule, only free, adult men whose parents also belonged to the civic community had civil rights. Women, slaves, strangers, and children were excluded. Nevertheless, the idea that politics did not only have to be a matter for a king, but could also be supported by citizens was significant. For the people, the polis was not only an administrative space, but part of their identity. Anyone who lived in Athens and was a citizen saw himself as an Athenian. Anyone born in Sparta belonged to the Spartan order. Loyalty was first and foremost to their own polis. They fought for them, paid taxes for them, took part in their festivals, and worshipped their gods. The citizen was not only a private individual, but a member of a political and religious community. Athens became particularly famous because an early form of democracy developed there. The word democracy comes from the Greek and means rule of the people. But here, too, you have to look closely. People did not mean all people, but only the male full citizens. Nevertheless, the development was extraordinary. In Athens, citizens could vote on important issues in the People's Assembly, on war and peace, laws, alliances, or political decisions. They could hear speeches, speak themselves, and cast their votes. Athens' democracy did not come about suddenly. It was the result of long social and political conflicts. Initially, noble families had great influence. Many simple farmers fell into debt bondage, lost land, or became economically dependent. The tensions within society became so great that reforms became necessary. An important figure was Solon, who carried out reforms in the early 6th century BC. He abolished debt bondage for Athenian citizens and ordered political participation according to wealth. This meant that Athens was not yet a democracy in the later sense, but an important step had been taken. Later, further reforms followed, especially by Cleisthenes. He reorganized the citizenry and strengthened the People's Assembly. This weakened the power of the old noble families. In the 5th century BC, Athenian democracy reached its classical form. Many offices were drawn by lot, so that the same rich and powerful men did not always rule. The council prepared decisions, courts were filled with citizens, and the People's Assembly remained the central political body. This democracy was direct. This means that citizens did not simply elect representatives who then made politics for several years, but they took part in decisions themselves. Anyone who was a citizen should participate politically. Talking, discussing, judging, and voting were part of the ideal of the Athenian citizen. This form of democracy was only possible because the number of full citizens was limited and because other groups remained excluded from political participation. The work of women, slaves, and strangers made it possible for many citizens to have time for politics in the first place. Sparta was structured quite differently. While Athens became known for democracy, naval power, theater, and debate, Sparta is considered a symbol of discipline, military, and strict order. Sparta was located in the Peloponnese, in the south of Greece. The Spartan society was designed to keep a small group of full citizens militarily strong and politically united. These full citizens were called Spartiates. They saw themselves as a community of warriors. The education of the Spartan boys was strict. They should learn obedience, toughness, endurance, and combativeness. Early on, they were accepted into state-organized groups. The goal was not personal development, but service to the polis. The individual Spartiate was to subordinate itself to the community. Luxury, long speeches, and a soft way of life were considered dangerous. The disciplined warrior who did not retreat in battle was ideal. But this order was based on strong social inequality. The Spartans were only a minority. Among them were the Pariakan, free inhabitants without full political rights, who engaged in trade and crafts. The Helots were still lower. They were a dependent population that farmed the land and had to pay taxes. The Helots were vital to Sparta, allowing the Spartans to devote themselves entirely to the military. At the same time, the Spartans lived in constant fear of uprisings. The strict military order was therefore also a means of controlling a large subjugated population. Athens and Sparta show two opposing models of Greek politics. Athens relied on participation, oratory, and civic decision-making, at least within the male citizenry. Sparta relied on stability, discipline, and military strength. Both systems had strengths and weaknesses. Athens could be creative, open, and dynamic, but it was also susceptible to power struggles, demagogues, and changing moods of the popular assembly. Sparta was stable and militarily impressive, but socially rigid and dependent on the oppression of the Helots. In addition to Athens and Sparta, there were many other polis with their own political forms. Some were ruled by nobles, i.e. oligarchic. Others had tyrants at times. The word tyrant originally did not necessarily mean a cruel ruler, but an autocrat who had not come to power in the traditional way. Some tyrants promoted trade, construction projects, and culture. Others ruled violently. The Greek world was therefore politically diverse and constantly on the move. Social life in the polis was strongly dependent on status. Free citizens had rights and obligations. They could own land, appear in court, take part in festivals, and fight for their polis in the war. Women, on the other hand, usually had no political rights. Their role was mainly in the household, in the family, and in religious tasks. In Athens, women usually lived more shielded from public political life. In Sparta, women had comparatively more freedom in everyday life and were able to manage property, because men were often militarily bound. However, there was no political equality there either. Slavery was widespread in the Greek world. Slaves worked in households, workshops, in fields, in mines, or as public labor. Some had relatively responsible tasks. Others lived under extremely harsh conditions. Especially the work in mines was dangerous and brutal. For many Greeks, slavery was a matter of course, even if it was a severe form of bondage and exploitation from today's perspective. The brilliant achievements of Greek culture thus arose in societies based on clear exclusions and inequalities. Strangers also played an important role. In Athens, permanently resident foreigners were called metochen. They could trade and practice crafts, but did not have full civil rights. They were especially important for the economy. The polis needed people who produced goods, equipped ships, lent money, or traded with other regions. Nevertheless, the political community remained narrowly limited. Religion connected the Greek polis with each other. The Greeks believed in many gods, including Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Poseidon, Demeter, Aphrodite, Ares, and Hermes. The gods were powerful, but not perfect. They had human characteristics, could be jealous, angry, helpful, or cunning. Each polis had special protective gods. Athens especially worshipped Athena, the goddess of wisdom and protection of the city. Religious festivals were central events in public life. Sacrifices, processions, competitions, theater performances, and joint celebrations strengthened the community. Religion was not separate from the state. Political decisions, wars, treaties, and festivals were often embedded in religion. Those who participated in the polis also took part in its cults. The Greek polis was thus a special form of coexistence. It combined politics, religion, military, business, and identity. It created spaces in which citizens could think about laws and power. At the same time, she excluded many people. It is precisely this contradiction that makes Greek history so important. It was here that ideas of freedom, civic participation, and political responsibility emerged, but these ideas only applied to a part of the population. When we talk about democracy today, we often look back to Athens. But we should do so with admiration and critical distance at the same time. Athenian democracy was a historic breakthrough because citizens were directly involved in political decisions. But it was not a modern democracy because women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded. Nevertheless, she asked a question that is still central today: who should decide on the community? The Greek polis gave different answers to this. Some relied on the power of a few, others on a strong single ruler, Sparta on military order, and Athens on the participation of its citizens. This diversity gave rise to a political culture that has profoundly shaped the history of Europe. In the next chapter, we will see how these often quarreling city-states suddenly faced a common challenge: the attack of the mighty Persian Empire. The Persian Wars were intended to show whether the independent polis could exist together despite their rivalries. Chapter 7: The Persian Wars. The Greek city-states were often at odds. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, and many other polis pursued their own interests, formed changing alliances, and fought against each other again and again. There was no common Greek empire, no unified army, and no central government. Nevertheless, in the early 5th century BC, a situation arose in which many Greeks began to see themselves more as part of a common world. The reason for this was a threat from outside: the powerful Persian Empire. At that time, the Persian Empire was the largest empire the world had ever seen. Under rulers such as Cyrus the Great, Cambyses, and Darius I, the Persians had conquered a huge area. It stretched from Asia Minor to Mesopotamia, Egypt, Persia, and to the borders of India. This empire was militarily strong, well organized, and had vast resources. The Persian kings ruled over many peoples, languages, and cultures. Their power was based on armies, taxes, roads, administration, and the prestige of the great king. The conflict between Greeks and Persians did not begin directly on the Greek mainland, but in Asia Minor. On the west coast of Asia Minor were Greek cities such as Miletus, Ephesus, and Halicarnassus. These cities were culturally Greek, but were under Persian rule. Many inhabitants of these cities wanted to regain their independence. Around 499 BC, the Ionian Revolt occurred. The Ionian Greeks rose up against the Persians and asked other Greek polis for help. Athens and Eretria supported the uprising. For the Persians, this was a serious encroachment on their rule. Although the revolt was eventually crushed, Darius I did not forget the help of Athens and Eretria. From the Persian point of view, these cities had interfered in the affairs of the great empire. From the Greek point of view, it was about the freedom of related cities. Thus, a regional uprising developed into a major conflict between the Persian Empire and the Greek polis. Darius decided to punish the Greek cities and to show his power on the Greek mainland as well. In 490 BC, a Persian army landed at Marathon, northeast of Athens. The Athenians were faced with a formidable challenge. Sparta, Greece's strongest land power, was unable to help in time. So the Athenians, together with the small troops from Plataea, had to take up the fight almost alone. The Battle of Marathon became one of the most famous events in Greek history. The Persians were experienced fighters, but the Athenians relied on their heavily armed hoplites. These Civil War fighters fought in close formation, the so-called phalanx. With shield, spear, and helmet, they formed a united front. The Athenians succeeded in pushing back and defeating the Persian troops. For Athens, this victory was of enormous importance. A single polis had resisted the empire. Marathon later became a symbol of courage, freedom, and Greek self-assertion. The victory greatly strengthened Athens' self-confidence. He showed that the Persians were not invincible. At the same time, the war was far from over. The Persians had suffered defeat, but their empire remained powerful. For them, the Marathon was more of a setback than a final decision. After the death of Darius, his son Xerxes took over the reign. Xerxes was preparing a new, much larger campaign against Greece. This time it was not just a punitive action, but the subjugation of the Greek polis. The preparations were enormous. A large army was assembled, a fleet was equipped, supplies were organized, and bridges were built across the Hellespont so that the Persian troops could move from Asia to Europe. The Greeks knew that a huge danger was coming their way, but they were by no means in agreement. Some polis wanted to resist. Others wanted to submit to the Persians or wait. Sparta and Athens in particular played a central role in the resistance. Sparta was famous for its land army. Athens had built up a strong fleet under Themistocles. This fleet was to become decisive. In 480 BC, Xerxes advanced into Greece with his army. The Greeks were looking for a place where they could stop the Persian superiority. One such place was the bottleneck of Thermopylae. There was a narrow path between the mountains and the sea. In this narrowness, the Persian majority could not be fully effective. At Thermopylae, a small Greek army led by the Spartan king Leonidas opposed the Persians. The 300 Spartans who fought with Leonidas became particularly famous. In fact, other Greek fighters were also involved, but the Spartan willingness to sacrifice shaped the later memory. For several days, the Greeks held the bottleneck. Eventually, the Persians found a way around the position through betrayal or local knowledge. Leonidas and his men stayed behind and were killed. Militarily, the Battle of Thermopylae was a defeat. Symbolically, however, it became a powerful sign. It stood for bravery, discipline, and the willingness to die for one's own polis and the freedom of Greece. The story of Leonidas and his men was later told many times, embellished and used politically. It shows how much historical events can become myths. After the breakthrough at Thermopylae, the Persians advanced further south. Athens was evacuated. Many inhabitants fled to the island of Salamis or other areas. The Persians took the city and destroyed parts of Athens, including sanctuaries on the Acropolis. This was a heavy blow for the Athenians. But the decision was not made on land, but at sea. Themistocles, the leading Athenian politician and strategist, relied on a naval battle in the narrow waters at Salamis. There, the large Persian fleet could not really play out its superiority. The Greek ships, so-called triremes, were maneuverable and suitable for fighting in confined spaces. In 480 BC, the Battle of Salamis took place. The Greeks won a decisive victory. The Persian fleet suffered heavy losses, and Xerxes withdrew to Asia with part of his troops. Salamis was one of the turning points of the Persian Wars. Without control over the sea, the Persians could hardly supply their huge army. Nevertheless, a Persian force remained in Greece. In the following year, 479 BC, the decisive land battle at Plataea took place. There, a Greek army under Spartan leadership defeated the Persians. In the same year, the Greeks also achieved another success against Persian forces at Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor. This averted the immediate danger of a Persian subjugation of the Greek mainland. The Persian Wars had far-reaching consequences. First, they strengthened the awareness of many Greeks that they had stood together against an external threat. Although the polis remained independent and often divided, a stronger idea of a common Greek identity emerged. The Greeks referred to themselves as Hellenes and distinguished themselves from the Persians, whom they referred to as barbarians. This word originally meant mainly people who did not speak Greek. Later, it took on a pejorative meaning. Athens in particular benefited greatly from the Persian Wars. The victory in Marathon had already boosted the city's self-confidence, but Salamis made Athens the leading maritime power. The Athenian fleet had been decisive for Greek success. After the war, Athens founded the Attictalian Sea League, an alliance of Greek cities that was originally intended to protect against further Persian attacks. The members provided ships or paid contributions. Over time, however, Athens increasingly transformed this alliance into its own instrument of power. This marked the beginning of Athens' rise to become a great power in the Aegean. The city became richer, more powerful, and more culturally significant. In the 5th century BC, Athens experienced its classical heyday. Temples were built, plays were performed, philosophers discussed, and democracy was further developed. But Athens' growing power also generated mistrust and resistance, especially among Sparta. The tensions between Athens and Sparta would later lead to the Peloponnesian War. The Persian Wars were also of great importance for Sparta. Sparta had taken over the command of the Greek land army at Plataea, and was still considered the strongest military power on the mainland. But unlike Athens, Sparta was more reluctant to embrace long-term naval power and more distant alliances. While Athens expanded outwards, Sparta remained more focused on the order of the Peloponnese and the control of its own society. In Greek memory, the Persian Wars became a struggle between freedom and submission. The Greeks liked to portray themselves as free citizens who fought against the absolute power of a great king. This image contains an important core, but it is also simplified. For the Greek polis themselves were not completely liberal. Many people were excluded from political participation, and slavery was a matter of course. Moreover, the Persian Empire was not only a tyrannical entity, but also a highly organized, culturally diverse empire. Nevertheless, the Persian Wars were a decisive moment in ancient history. They prevented the Greek polis from coming directly under Persian rule. This allowed Greece's political, cultural, and philosophical developments to continue to unfold. Without the Greek success against Persia, the history of Athens, democracy, theater, and classical philosophy might have taken a very different course. The Persian Wars also show that history is often marked by contrasts. Small city-states against a huge empire, citizen armies against royal armies, independence against a large empire, regional rivalry against common resistance. But they also show that such contrasts are never easy. The Greeks were not always united, the Persians were not always oppressors, and victories had consequences that produced new conflicts. In the end, the Greeks were victorious, but the joint fight against Persia did not lead to lasting unity. On the contrary, the rise of Athens after the Persian Wars shifted the balance in Greece. Sparta and other polis increasingly saw Athens' power as a threat. Thus, the victory over Persia indirectly prepared the next great conflict, the struggle of the Greeks against each other. In the next chapter, we look at classical Greece and especially at Athens in the age of Pericles. It was a time of political power, artistic masterpieces, philosophical questions, and cultural flourishing. But behind the splendor of this era were imperial ambition, social inequality and tensions that were soon to erupt openly. Chapter 8. Classical Greece. After the Persian Wars, Greece began a period that was later referred to as the Classical Era. Athens in particular now moved into the center of the Greek world. The city had played a decisive role in the battles against Persia, especially through its fleet. This military success transformed Athens into a political and cultural superpower. In the 5th century BC, the city became a center of democracy, art, architecture, theater, philosophy, and science. Many ideas and works that we associate with ancient Greece today date back to this time. But the splendor of Athens also had another side. The city grew not only through freedom and citizen participation, but also through power politics, economic dependencies, and the exploitation of other polis. It is precisely this contradiction that makes classical Greece so interesting. On the one hand, ideas of democracy, education, and reason arose here that are still admired today. On the other hand, Athens' power rested on a maritime alliance that increasingly morphed into an Athenian empire. After the victory over the Persians, many Greek cities wanted to prevent the Persian Empire from attacking again. Therefore, the Attic-Delian Sea League was founded in 478 BC. Its center was initially on the island of Delos, where the common federal treasury was also kept. The members provided ships or paid dues to maintain a common fleet. Athens took the lead, as it was the strongest naval power. Initially, this alliance appeared as a Schutzgemeinschaft Freier Polis. But over time, Athens increasingly used the federal government for its own interests. Cities that wanted to leave were often prevented from doing so by force. Contributions were collected, Athenian garrisons were deployed, and the federal treasury was later transferred from Delos to Athens. This made it clear that an alliance had become an instrument of power. Athens used it to finance not only warships, but also construction projects and its own political order. This development brought advantages for the citizens of Athens. For many allies, however, it meant dependence. The formative figure of this time was Pericles. He was not a king or an autocrat, but an influential politician, orator, and strategist. For many years, he played a decisive role in determining Athens' politics. Under his leadership, Athenian democracy reached its classical form. Pericles promoted the participation of citizens in political life. To enable poorer citizens to hold public office, payments were introduced for certain activities. Thus, politics should not be reserved only for the rich. Athenian democracy was based on direct participation. The People's Assembly was the central body. There, full male citizens were able to vote on important issues: war and peace, laws, alliances, finances, and political decisions. The council prepared many topics, courts were filled with citizens, and numerous offices were drawn by lot. This system was intended to prevent only a few families from permanently controlling power. Nevertheless, Athens' democracy was limited. Women were excluded, as were slaves and permanently resident foreigners, the so-called metochen. Only part of the population had political rights. The freedom of the citizens stood next to the lack of freedom of many other people. This is precisely why we have to look at Athenian democracy in two ways. On the one hand, it was an important step in the history of political participation, but on the other hand, it remained severely limited from today's perspective. During this time, some of the most famous buildings of antiquity were built in Athens. After the destruction of the city by the Persians, the Acropolis was redesigned. The most important building was the Parthenon, the temple of the goddess Athena. It was not only intended to express religious veneration, but also to show Athens' power, wealth, and cultural aspirations. The architecture was carefully planned, the proportions were harmonious, and the sculptural decor glorified gods, myths, and the city itself. The Acropolis was thus more than a religious place. It was a political sign. Anyone who saw them should realize, Athens is rich, powerful, pious, and culturally superior. The construction of such monuments employed many craftsmen, artists, and workers. At the same time, it was made possible by funds that also came from the Seabund. In this way, artistic greatness was combined with imperial power politics. The theater also achieved outstanding importance in classical Athens. Theater was not just entertainment, but part of religious and political life. At festivals in honor of the god Dionysus, tragedies and comedies were performed. Thousands of citizens were able to see the performances. The plays dealt with questions that were important for the whole community: guilt, justice, power, war, family, divine will, and human responsibility. Poets such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides created tragedies that are still read and performed today. Her works showed people in serious conflicts. Personal wishes, divine commandments, and state order often stood against each other. In such stories, Athenians could reflect on their own lives and polis. The comedies of Aristophanes, on the other hand, mocked politicians, philosophers, social fashions, and war. They show that the Athenian public also offered room for criticism and ridicule. In addition to the theater, historiography developed. Herodotus described the Persian Wars and was interested in foreign peoples, customs, and causes of historical events. He is often considered the father of historiography, even though his works still contain stories, anecdotes, and religious interpretations. Thucydides later took a different path. In his depiction of the Peloponnesian War, he searched for political causes, power interests, and human motives. He wanted to explain history as soberly as possible. He thus became one of the most important precursors of analytical historiography. Philosophy also gained a new meaning in classical Greece. Even before that, thinkers in Ionia had tried to explain the world not only through myths, but through natural principles. In Athens, the focus was now more on people themselves. One of the most important figures was Socrates. He did not write any books himself, but his pupil Plato made him famous through dialogues. Socrates asked questions: what is justice? What is virtue? What is knowledge? How should one live? Socrates did not claim to have ready-made answers. He got his interlocutors to examine their own convictions. This kind of questioning could be uncomfortable. It questioned authorities, traditions, and apparent certainties. For some Athenians, Socrates was a dangerous troublemaker. In 399 BC, he was accused of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods of the city. He was sentenced to death and drank the hemlock cup. His death later became a symbol of the conflict between free thought and political community. Plato, the student of Socrates, developed a comprehensive philosophy from this. He asked about truth, knowledge, soul, justice, and the ideal state. In his academy, he trained students and shaped thinking for centuries. One of these students was Aristotle. He was interested in almost all areas of knowledge: logic, ethics, politics, biology, physics, poetry, and rhetoric. Aristotle observed, ordered, and systematized. With him, Greek philosophy reached an enormous breadth. Classical Greece was also a time of scientific curiosity. Mathematicians, doctors, and natural scientists searched for rational explanations. In medicine, the name Hippocrates became famous. Hippocratic medicine tried to understand diseases not only as punishment from the gods, but as natural processes in the body. Even though many ideas of that time are outdated from today's perspective, the approach was important. Observation, experience, and explanation should play a greater role. In everyday life in Athens, however, not all people lived in the splendor of democracy and philosophy. Most of them had to work as farmers, craftsmen, traders, sailors, servants, or slaves. The city was lively, noisy, cramped, and full of social differences. On the agora, the market square, citizens, traders, politicians, and strangers met. Goods were sold there, messages were exchanged, and political talks were held. The agora was an economic and public center at the same time. Women had only limited rights in Athens. Their lives were mainly focused on household, family, and religious tasks. They were denied political participation. Metochen played an important role in trade and crafts, but remained without full civil rights. Slaves were present in many areas of life. They worked in households, workshops, mines, and public services. Without their work, Athens' prosperity would hardly have been possible. This is one of the reasons why classical Greece should not only be regarded as a golden age. It was a time of impressive cultural achievements, but also a time of war, exclusion, and domination. The Athenians spoke of freedom while controlling other polis. They developed democracy, while large parts of the population remained excluded. They created works of art of extraordinary beauty, but financed them in part through political domination. It is precisely these tensions that make the epoch so important. Classical Greece shows that great cultural achievements do not have to arise in perfect societies. They often arise in conflictual, contradictory, and dynamic times. Athens was open to debate, but not free of repression. It was democratic for citizens, but not equal for everyone. It was culturally brilliant, but politically ambitious and power-conscious. The classical era had a profound influence on later history. Architecture, philosophy, theater, historiography, and political terms from this period were taken up again and again. Romans, Renaissance scholars, Enlightenment thinkers, and modern democracies looked back on Athens, sometimes admiringly, sometimes critically. Terms such as democracy, politics, ethics, logic, tragedy, and rhetoric lead us directly into this world. But Athens' rise was not without consequences. The more powerful Athens became, the stronger the mistrust of other polis. Sparta in particular saw the Athenian naval power and the influence of the Maritime League as a threat. The Greek world, which had just stood together against Persia, was now heading for a major internal Greek conflict. The splendor of classical Athens was real, but it stood on an uncertain foundation. The next chapter is therefore about the Peloponnesian War. This war between Athens and Sparta shook the entire Greek world. He showed how quickly rivalry, fear, and striving for power can plunge a culture into crisis. Chapter 9: The Peloponnesian War. After the victory over the Persians, one might have expected the Greek city-states to move closer together. After all, they had resisted a formidable external threat together. But exactly the opposite happened. The common enemy had been pushed back, and now the old rivalries became more prominent again. Two powers in particular were increasingly suspicious of each other: Athens and Sparta. After the Persian Wars, Athens had become the leading maritime power in the Greek world. With its fleet, it controlled large parts of the Aegean Sea. The Anatolian Sea League, which had originally been founded to protect against further Persian attacks, developed more and more into an Athenian sphere of influence. Many allies had to pay contributions, but could hardly determine their own foreign policy. Anyone who opposed Athens or wanted to leave the alliance had to reckon with military force. Sparta, on the other hand, was the strongest land power in Greece. Spartan society was geared towards military discipline. Their citizens, the Spartans, saw themselves as a community of warriors. Sparta led the Peloponnesian League, an alliance system of several cities in the Peloponnese and beyond. While Athens dominated at sea, Sparta had a strong army. A dangerous equilibrium arose between the two powers. The Peloponnesian War was therefore not simply a dispute between two cities. It was a struggle between two political systems, two alliance systems, and two ideas of power. Athens stood for democracy, naval power, trade, and a growing empire. Sparta stood for oligarchy, land power, military order, and the claim to defend the freedom of the Greek cities against Athenian domination. Of course, this juxtaposition was also propaganda. Sparta spoke of freedom, but ruled strictly over its allies and oppressed the Helots. Athens spoke of democracy, but often treated its allies as subjects. The actual war began in 431 BC. Even before that, there had been tensions, minor conflicts, and mutual accusations. The Greek historian Thucydides, who was himself a contemporary witness, saw the deeper cause of the war in Athens' growing power and in the fear it caused in Sparta. This observation is still famous today because it shows that wars often arise not only from individual events, but from long-term shifts in power and trust. At the beginning of the war, both sides pursued different strategies. Sparta and his army regularly invaded Attica, the outskirts of Athens, and devastated fields. The Spartans hoped to force Athens into an open land battle. But Pericles, the leading politician of Athens, wanted to avoid exactly that. He knew that the Athenian army was inferior to the Spartans on land. Instead, he had the rural population brought behind the long walls of Athens. These walls connected the city to the port of Piraeus and secured access to the fleet. Athens was to remain strong at sea, receive supplies from the port, and at the same time attack the coasts of the opponents with its fleet. This strategy was clever, but it had serious consequences. Many people crowded together within the walls of Athens. The city became overcrowded, hygienic conditions deteriorated, and soon a devastating epidemic broke out. It killed a large part of the population. Pericles also died of this disease. This was a heavy blow for Athens. The city not only lost many people, but also a politician who had long stood for cautious and controlled warfare. After Pericles' death, Athenian politics became more restless. New politicians emerged who were often more aggressive and willing to take risks. The war dragged on without either side being able to achieve a clear victory. Athens remained strong at sea, Sparta on land. Both sides tried to weaken the enemy's allies, promote insurgencies, or control strategically important places. As a result, the war was not only waged in Attica and the Peloponnese, but in many parts of the Greek world. A particularly grim example of the harshness of this time was the fate of the island of Melos. Melos was a smaller island that wanted to remain neutral. Athens, however, demanded their submission. The Melians invoked law and neutrality, but the Athenians argued with power. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. After Melos refused, the island was conquered. The men were killed, women and children enslaved. This episode shows the brutal side of Athenian power politics. A city that was democratic on the inside could act ruthlessly imperial on the outside. In the meantime, peace was reached, the so-called Nicaea's Peace of 421 BC. He was supposed to end the war, but trust between the sides was destroyed. Many allies were dissatisfied, old conflicts remained, and both camps used the peacetime to improve their positions. So peace was more of a pause than a real new beginning. The decisive turning point came with the Sicilian expedition. In 415 BC, Athens decided to send a large fleet to Sicily to attack the city of Syracuse. The plan was ambitious. Athens wanted to expand its influence far to the west, gain new resources, and increase its own power. But the undertaking was extremely risky. Sicily was far away, Syracuse was strong, and it was difficult to supply a large force over such distances. One of the main proponents of this expedition was Alcibiades, a charismatic, ambitious, and controversial Athenian politician. Shortly after the start of the operation, however, he was recalled to Athens because he was accused of religious offenses. Instead of facing the trial, he fled and later even switched to the side of Sparta for a time. This turn of events shows how unstable and personal the politics of the time had become. The Sicilian expedition ended in disaster. The Athenians could not take Syracuse. Their fleet was surrounded and destroyed, their army defeated. Thousands of soldiers were killed or captured. Many prisoners had to work in quarries under terrible conditions. For Athens, this defeat was a shock. A large part of the fleet and many experienced men were lost. The dream of an expansion of Athenian power in the West had been shattered. After this catastrophe, Athens' opponents smelled their chance. Sparta changed its strategy. On the advice of Alcibiades, the Spartans permanently occupied Decelia in Attica. From there, they could constantly threaten Athens and weaken it economically. At the same time, Sparta received support from Persia. This was particularly remarkable. The Persians, against whom many Greeks had once fought together, now became Sparta's important financiers. With Persian money, the Spartans were able to build their own fleet and challenge Athens in its strongest territory. Athens continued to fight despite everything. The city showed astonishing resilience. It built new ships, won individual naval victories, and tried to keep its alliances together. But the situation became more and more difficult. Political crises arose within Athens. At times, oligarchic groups tried to overthrow democracy. The burdens of the war, the financial problems, and the military losses weakened confidence in the democratic order. The final blow came in 405 BC at Mesopotamia. There, the Spartan general Lysander succeeded in almost completely destroying the Athenian fleet. Without a fleet, Athens was lost. The city could no longer be adequately supplied with grain, and its naval power collapsed. In 404 BC, Athens had to capitulate. The long walls were torn down, the fleet was handed over, and Athens lost its supremacy. After the victory, Sparta installed an oligarchic government in Athens, which became known as the Rule of the 30. This group ruled brutally, persecuted opponents, and had many people executed or expelled. It was soon overthrown, and democracy was restored in Athens. But the city was no longer the undisputed great power it had been in the age of Pericles. The Peloponnesian War profoundly changed the Greek world. It weakened not only Athens, but ultimately all those involved. Sparta had won, but his strength was also limited. The decades of fighting had destroyed cities, cost lives, damaged the economy and agriculture, and permanently poisoned trust between the polis. The war showed how even a culturally highly developed world can fall into a serious crisis through the quest for power and rivalry. The war also left its mark morally. Thucydides describes how language and values changed during the war. Courage was confused with ruthlessness, caution was considered cowardice, moderation as weakness. Civil wars within individual cities were cruelly fought. Alliances changed, betrayal became commonplace, and political opponents were no longer seen as fellow citizens but as enemies. So the war destroyed not only walls and ships, but also norms and trust. The Peloponnesian War was a turning point in the history of Greece. The classical heyday of Athens was over. Although Athens remained culturally significant, especially in philosophy and education, its political power was broken. Sparta could not stabilize the lead permanently. Soon new powers emerged, including Thebes and finally Macedonia. The dissension of the Greek polis made it easier for an external ruler to bring them under his control. The war between Athens and Sparta shows one of the great lessons of ancient history. A joint victory against an external enemy does not guarantee lasting peace. Power, fear, ambition, and distrust can turn former allies into bitter opponents. The Persian Wars had united Greece, but the Peloponnesian War tore this unity apart again. At the same time, this war shows how closely political systems are linked to their foreign policy. Athens' democracy was alive and open to debate at home, but its empire demanded coercion and military control. Sparta's order was stable and disciplined, but it was based on oppression and could not offer other cities an attractive future. Both powers fought in the name of great principles, but both often acted out of self-interest. In the end, an exhausted Greek world was left behind. The great polis had used up their strength. Their rivalries were not resolved, but only postponed. Out of this weakness, a new power was soon to rise, Macedonia. Under Philip II and later his son Alexander the Great, the northern kingdom became a force that was to change the entire Greek world. The next chapter is therefore about Alexander the Great and Hellenism. His conquests took Greek culture far beyond the Aegean, to Egypt, Persia, and India. This marked the beginning of a new phase of antiquity, in which Greek ideas, Oriental traditions, and imperial power merged. Chapter 10: Alexander the Great and Hellenism. After the Peloponnesian War, the Greek world was exhausted. Athens had lost its supremacy, Sparta was unable to consolidate its rule permanently, and Thebes, which later briefly rose to become the leading power, did not remain superior for long. The Greek polis continued to be culturally significant, but politically deeply divided. Decades of war had destroyed trust, weakened alliances, and put an economic strain on many cities. It was precisely in this situation that a power came to the fore that many Greeks had not taken seriously for a long time: Macedonia. Macedonia was located in the north of the Greek world. For many Greeks from the classical city-states, it was considered backward or semi-foreign. But under King Philip II, this changed fundamentally. Philip was an extraordinarily capable ruler. He reformed the army, strengthened the royal power, and skillfully exploited the weakness of the Greek polis. His army became one of the best in the world at the time. Particularly important was the Macedonian phalanx, whose soldiers carried long lances, so-called sarissa. This formation was able to keep enemy lines at a distance and was supplemented by cavalry, light troops, and siege technology. Philip II understood not only war, but also diplomacy. He formed alliances, supported certain groups in Greek cities, exploited conflicts between polis, and acted sometimes as a protector, sometimes as a conqueror. Many Greeks disagreed on how to react to him. Some saw him as a threat to freedom. Others hoped that he could bring order to the divided Greek world. The famous Athenian orator Demosthenes passionately warned against Philip's power. But the Greek cities were not able to join forces permanently in time. In 338 BC, the decisive Battle of Chaeronea took place. Philip defeated an alliance of Athens, Thebes, and other Greek forces. This severely restricted the political independence of most Greek polis. Philip founded the Corinthian League, in which many Greek cities were united under Macedonian leadership. His great goal was a joint campaign against the Persian Empire. But before he could implement this plan himself, Philip was murdered in 336 BC. His son Alexander took over the reign. He was only 20 years old at the time. Many opponents hoped that Macedonia would become weaker under such a young king. But Alexander reacted quickly and decisively. He secured his rule in Macedonia, forced recalcitrant Greek cities into subordination, and made it clear that he would continue his father's plans. When the city of Thebes rose up against him, Alexander had it destroyed. This harsh approach was intended to show the other Greeks that resistance was dangerous. Alexander had been prepared for rule and war from his youth. His teacher was Aristotle, one of the most important philosophers of antiquity. Alexander received a Greek education from him and became acquainted with literature, philosophy, politics, and science. He was particularly impressed by the Homeric epics. Achilles, the hero of the Iliad, became a role model for Alexander. He wanted to gain fame, do great deeds, and make his name immortal. In 334 BC, Alexander began his campaign against Persia. The Persian Empire was huge, rich in tradition, but no longer as closed as in earlier times. Nevertheless, it was a huge challenge. Alexander crossed the Hellespont and entered Asia Minor. Right at the beginning, he defeated Persian troops at the Granicus. This victory opened the way for him along the coast of Asia Minor. Many Greek cities there were liberated from Persian rule, at least from Alexander's point of view. In fact, it often only meant that they now came under Macedonian influence. In 333 BC, Alexander met the Persian great king Darius III at Issos. The battle ended with a clear victory for Alexander. Darius fled, and his family fell into Alexander's hands. Alexander treated them demonstratively respectfully, which also had a political effect. He wanted to appear not only as a conqueror, but as a rightful ruler who understood royal dignity. After Issos, Alexander did not immediately move to the Persian heartland, but turned south. He wanted to control the coasts of the eastern Mediterranean so that the Persian fleet would no longer have a secure base. The siege of Tyre was particularly difficult. The city was located on an island and was considered almost impregnable. Alexander had a dam built, used siege engines, and finally conquered the city after months of siege. The victory was brutal, but strategically important. After that, Alexander moved to Egypt. There he was not received as a destroyer, but rather as a liberator from Persian rule. In Egypt, he founded a city that would later become one of the most important metropolises in the ancient world, Alexandria. This city became a center of commerce, science, education, and culture. In addition, Alexander had himself confirmed as the son of the god Ammonius in the oasis of Siwa, which religiously charged his rule. This may seem strange to Greeks, but for Alexander it was part of a larger policy. He wanted to be not only Macedonian king and leader of the Greeks, but ruler of many peoples. In 331 BC, the decisive battle against Darius III took place at Gaugamela. Although the Persians had a large army, Alexander won again. This victory opened the way for him to the centers of the Persian Empire: Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, and Ecbatana. The rich treasuries fell into his hands. Persepolis, a symbolically particularly important royal city of the Persians, was plundered and partly burned down. Whether this was done as revenge for the Persian destruction of Athens or out of a spontaneous decision is disputed. In any case, it was a strong sign. The old Persian Empire had been defeated. Darius fled further east, but was murdered by his own people. Alexander now presented himself as his avenger and adopted Persian forms of rule. He sometimes wore Persian clothing, adopted elements of court ceremonial, and took Persian nobles into his administration. This is exactly what led to tensions with his Macedonian companions. Many of them had expected to defeat and rule Persia, but not to adopt Persian customs. Alexander, however, thought bigger. He wanted to create a world empire in which Macedonian, Greek, and Persian elements were combined. His campaign did not end with the conquest of Persia. Alexander moved on to Central Asia and finally to India. There he encountered new landscapes, new enemies, and new challenges. In 326 BC, he defeated King Poros on the Hydaspes. But his soldiers were exhausted. They had fought for years, covered unimaginable distances, and did not want to march any further into the unknown. At the Hyphasis River, they refused to go any further. Alexander had to give in. The way back was difficult, especially the march through the Gedrosian desert claimed many victims. Back in Babylon, Alexander apparently planned further ventures. But in 323 BC he died suddenly, only 32 years old. The exact cause of death is still unclear today. Illness, exhaustion, infection, or poisoning were discussed. What is certain is that his death left behind a huge empire without a clear successor. Alexander had changed the political map of the ancient world in just a few years, but he had not created a stable order that would outlast him. After his death, his generals, the so-called Diadochi, began to fight for power. Alexander's empire disintegrated into several large successor empires. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt, the Seleucids in Syria and large parts of Asia, and the Antigonids in Macedonia. These empires were monarchical, often militarily strong and culturally diverse. The Greek polis remained important, but the main political role was now played by large kingdoms. This new epoch is called Hellenism. The term describes the spread of Greek language, art, education, and ways of life to large parts of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. Greek became an important lingua franca. Cities based on the Greek model were founded or expanded. Theaters, grammar schools, temples, markets, and administrative buildings shaped many urban centers. At the same time, Greek traditions mixed with Egyptian, Persian, Babylonian, and other local cultures. Alexandria in Egypt became the symbol of this new world. The city had a famous lighthouse, a large harbor, the Museion, and the Library of Alexandria. Scholars from different regions worked there on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, literature, and philology. Hellenism was a time of intensive exchange of knowledge. Names such as Euclid, Archimedes, and Eratosthenes stand for scientific achievements that had an impact far beyond their time. Art also changed. While classical Greek art often emphasized harmony, measure, and ideal beauty, Hellenistic art showed more movement, emotion, drama, and individuality. Rulers allowed themselves to be depicted powerfully, cities adorned themselves with monuments, and sculptures showed pain, old age, victory, or despair with new intensity. The world had become bigger, more diverse, and more restless, and that was exactly what was reflected in art. Politically, however, Hellenism did not mean freedom for all. The great kingdoms were ruled by dynasties that relied on armies, administration, and royal self-expression. Cities could have certain freedoms, but were often dependent on rulers. Mercenary armies, court intrigues, and wars between the successor kingdoms shaped the time. Alexander's dream of unity turned into decades-long power struggles after his death. Nevertheless, Hellenism was one of the most momentous epochs of antiquity. Through Alexander and his successors, Greek culture became no longer just the culture of the Aegean, but an international language of education and way of life. People from different traditions met each other in cities, administrations, armies, and trade networks. Ideas wandered over huge distances. Religions influenced each other. New forms of science and philosophy emerged. Alexander the Great, therefore, remains one of the most fascinating and controversial figures in history. Was he a brilliant general, a ruthless conqueror, a visionary of a world empire, or a driven seeker of fame? He was probably all of these things at the same time. He destroyed cities, waged brutal wars, and demanded inhumane things from his soldiers. At the same time, his campaign opened up new spaces for exchange and fundamentally changed the cultural history of the Old World. With Alexander, the classical world of independent Greek polis ends as a leading force. In its place is a larger, more networked, and monarchically shaped world. But while the Hellenistic kingdoms were emerging in the east, a new power was growing in the west. From a city on the Tiber, a state slowly developed that was to dominate first Italy and later the entire Mediterranean region, Rome. This is exactly where the next chapter takes us. Chapter 11: The Beginnings of Rome. While Alexander the Great and later the Hellenistic kingdoms changed the political map in the east, a power grew up in the west that initially seemed inconspicuous. Rome did not begin as a world empire. It was not a brilliant metropolis that dominated the Mediterranean region from the beginning. Rome originated as a settlement on the Tiber, in a landscape of central Italy characterized by hills, rivers, farms, and smaller communities. And yet this city was to become one of the most powerful empires in history. The Romans themselves told their beginnings in the form of a famous legend. According to this, Rome was founded by Romulus in 753 BC. Romulus and his twin brother Remus were the sons of the god of war Mars and the king's daughter Rhea Silvia. They were abandoned as infants, but a she-wolf found and suckled them. Later, they were taken in and raised by a shepherd. As young men, they decided to found a city. But there was an argument between the brothers. Romulus killed Remus and became the first king of Rome. This story is not a sober historical description, but a founding myth. It was supposed to explain where Rome came from and what Rome was all about. Already in the legend Divine Descent, violence, fratricidal war, courage, and domination are combined. The Romans saw themselves as a people with a special purpose. At the same time, history shows that they understood their own past not only as a peaceful beginning, but also as a history of conflict and power. Historically, Rome probably originated from several settlements on the hills along the Tiber. The location was convenient. The river enabled trade and connection to the interior. A ford made it easier to cross the Tiber. In addition, Rome was located between different cultural areas: the Latins in the south, the Sabines in the mountains, and the Etruscans in the north. This neighborhood was crucial to Rome's early development. From the very beginning, Rome has been a place of contact, reception, and exchange. The Etruscans were particularly important. They lived north of Rome in Etruria, the present-day territory of Tuscany and neighboring regions. The Etruscans were culturally highly developed. They built cities, traded, and had their own script, ornate tombs, religious rituals, and strong rulers. Rome adopted many influences from them: religious symbols, official insignia, building forms, drainage technology, and presumably also elements of political rule. The early Roman royal period was strongly influenced by Etruscans. According to Roman tradition, Rome was initially ruled by 7 kings. This royal period is said to have lasted from the founding of the city until 509 BC. Whether all these kings existed in exactly the same way historically is uncertain. Later Roman historiography mixed memory, legend, and political interpretation. Nevertheless, the narrative of the royal period reflects real developments. Rome grew, became more urban, organized its religion, built public institutions, and developed political structures. An important building project in the early period was the draining of swampy areas between the hills. This later became the Roman Forum, the city's central square. The Forum became the political, religious, and economic center of Rome. This is where meetings were held, where temples stood, where justice was administered, where trade was conducted and politics was made. The fact that a swampy valley became the heart of the city shows how much Rome was shaped by organization and collaborative work. According to tradition, the last Roman king was Tarquinius Superbus, i.e. Tarquinius the Proud. He was considered a tyrannical ruler. After a serious act of violence within the royal family and an uprising of the Roman aristocracy, the royal rule was overthrown. In 509 BC, Rome is said to have become a republic. Whether this date is exactly correct is less important than the significance it had for the Romans. They understood their political order as a countermodel to royal rule. Never again should a single man rule Rome unchecked. The republic was a new form of political order. The word residential publica means public matter or common matter. Power was no longer to lie with one king, but was to be distributed among several offices, assemblies, and the Senate. At the top were 2 consuls, each elected for 1 year. They led the army, directed politics, and represented the state. The fact that there were 2 consuls and their term of office was limited was intended to prevent one of them from becoming too powerful. In addition to the consuls, there were other offices. Praetors were primarily responsible for justice. Quaestors managed finances. Aediles took care of public order, markets, and games. Censors kept lists of citizens and paid attention to customs and wealth. In times of need, a dictator could be appointed, who was given extraordinary powers for a short time. This also shows that the Romans did not reject power in principle, but wanted to control it and limit it in time. The Senate played a particularly important role. Originally, it was a council of the leading families. In the Republic, it became the most powerful political body, even if its decisions were often formally recommendations. The Senate controlled finances, foreign policy, religion, and long-term state decisions. Its members came from the upper class and had mostly held political office. As a result, the Republic remained strongly aristocratic. Roman society in the early Republic was determined by a fundamental contradiction: the conflict between patricians and plebeians. The patricians were the old noble families who initially possessed many political and religious privileges. The plebeians formed the larger group of other free citizens. They included farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and also wealthy men, but they did not belong to the old noble families. Although plebeians fought in the army and paid taxes, they initially had significantly fewer political rights. This developed into the so-called class struggle. The plebeians demanded protection from arbitrariness, access to offices, legal certainty, and political participation. An important means was collective refusal. According to tradition, the plebeians withdrew from the city several times and refused to serve and cooperate. Since Rome was dependent on its citizens as soldiers and workers, the patricians had to make concessions. One result was the office of the tribune of the people. Tribunes of the people were supposed to protect the plebeians. They could intervene against measures taken by public officials and had a veto right. Her person was considered inviolable. Later, popular assemblies and plebeian resolutions also became more important. Another important step was the recording of law in the laws of the 12 Tables in the 5th century BC. This made law more visible and less dependent on the interpretation of patrician priests and ministers. Over time, plebeians gained access to more and more offices. The consulate was also open to them. The antagonism between patricians and plebeians did not disappear completely, but a new political leadership emerged from old patrician and rich plebeian families. This elite is called nobility. Rome therefore did not remain a democracy in the modern sense. Political participation was strongly dependent on origin, wealth, reputation, and networks. Nevertheless, the Republic developed mechanisms that involved different groups and distributed power on several shoulders. A central basis of Roman society was the family. The father, the paterfamilias, had a very strong legal standing over his family, which included not only his wife and children, but also slaves and property. The family was not only a private sphere, but also an economic and social unit. Ancestors, names, honor, and duty played a major role. For the Roman upper class, it was important to preserve the achievements of their ancestors and to increase the fame of the family. The Roman religion was closely linked to the state and everyday life. The Romans worshipped many gods, including Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Vesta, and Minerva. Many deities were later equated with Greek gods. In Rome, religion meant less personal faith in the modern sense, but above all correct rituals. If sacrifices, prayers, and omens were properly observed, it was believed that the goodwill of the gods would be secured. Priests, augurs, and other religious officials therefore played an important political role. The military was also central to Rome from the beginning. The citizens were also soldiers. Those who owned land had to serve and provide their equipment in the event of war. The early Roman army was closely connected to the civic community. War was not only a matter for a professional army, but a duty of the citizens. This combination of citizenship, land ownership, and military service shaped the Republic for a long time. In the first centuries, Rome had to survive mainly in Italy. The city fought against neighbors such as Latins, Sabines, Etruscans, Volscians, and Equor. These conflicts were often harsh, but they gradually led to the expansion of Roman power. Rome developed a special ability. Defeated opponents were not always simply destroyed, but often integrated in different forms. Some received civil rights, others alliance treaties, and still others had to provide troops. This created a growing network of dependencies and loyalties. This ability to integrate was one of the reasons for Rome's later success. While many ancient cities only subdued defeated enemies, Rome found ways to bind them to itself in the long term. Of course, this was not done out of sheer generosity. It was about power, soldiers, land, and security. But the result was a flexible system that made Rome available to more and more people and resources. The beginnings of Rome do not show a finished world power, but a city under construction. Rome learned from its neighbors, especially the Etruscans. It developed a republic that wanted to avoid royal rule, but remained strongly influenced by elites. Internally, there was a struggle for rights between patricians and plebeians. It combined religion, family, military, and politics into a stable order, and it began to bring its environment under control step by step. It is precisely this early phase that is decisive, because it was here that many of the foundations of later success emerged: the aversion to royalty, the importance of the Senate, the power of the offices, the pride of the citizens, the military duty, the ability to organize, and the willingness to involve defeated opponents. A city on the Tiber slowly became a state that could do more than just defend itself. In the next chapter, we see how Rome reached beyond Italy and became a world power. In doing so, it came into conflict with another great power in the Western Mediterranean, Carthage. The Punic Wars were to change Rome and open the way to an empire. Chapter 12: Rome becomes a world power. After Rome had consolidated its internal order and spread further and further in Italy, the city was faced with a new challenge. Until now, Rome had fought mainly against neighbors on the Italian peninsula. But now the entire Mediterranean region came into focus. Step by step, A regional power became a state that reached beyond Italy and had to compete with other great powers. The decisive opponent on this path was Carthage. Carthage was located in North Africa, in today's Tunisia. The city was originally founded by Phoenicians and developed into a rich trading and maritime power. Carthage controlled important trade routes in the western Mediterranean, had bases on islands and coasts, and had a strong fleet. While Rome drew its strength mainly from its citizen army and alliances in Italy, Carthage was particularly powerful in trade and at sea. Both powers were not necessarily enemies at first, but when their interests collided, conflict became almost inevitable. The first major clash arose around Sicily. This island was strategically located between Italy and North Africa. Whoever controlled Sicily controlled an important part of the western Mediterranean. It was there that Rome and Carthage clashed in the 3rd century BC. The First Punic War began in 264 BC and lasted more than 20 years. The word Punic is derived from the Phoenicians, from whom the Carthaginians descended. For Rome, this war was a new experience. Until then, Rome had mainly fought land wars. Against Carthage, it now had to learn to fight at sea. The Carthaginians were experienced seafarers. Rome, on the other hand, did not initially have a large fleet. But the Romans showed an ability that became typical of their rise. They adapted. They rebuilt warships, developed new tactics, and tried to turn naval warfare into a kind of land combat. A special device, the so-called boarding bar, enabled Roman soldiers to cross over to enemy ships and fight there as if they were on land. The war was long, expensive, and costly. Both sides suffered heavy defeats and had to muster enormous resources. In the end, Rome prevailed. Carthage had to give up Sicily and pay a high war compensation. For Rome, this was a historic turning point. Sicily became the first Roman province. This meant that Rome no longer ruled only over Italian allies, but administered an area outside Italy directly. This marked the beginning of Roman provincial rule. But the peace between Rome and Carthage was not lasting. Carthage was looking for new ways to rebuild its power and wealth. Spain became particularly important. There, the Carthaginians acquired new territories, raw materials, and soldiers. One of the most important families of Carthage was the family of the Barcides. Hannibal, one of the most famous generals of antiquity, came from her. The Second Punic War began in 218 BC. Hannibal chose a strategy that the Romans had not expected. He did not attack Italy directly from Africa, but moved with his army from Spain over the Alps to Italy. This march became legendary. Hannibal led soldiers, horsemen, and even war elephants over difficult mountains. Many people and animals died on the way, but the surprise effect was enormous. Suddenly, there was a Carthaginian army in Italy. Hannibal proved to be a military genius. He defeated the Romans in several battles, especially devastating in 216 BC at Cannae. There he succeeded in encircling and almost completely destroying a much larger Roman army. Cannae became one of the heaviest defeats in Roman history. Many other states would have collapsed after such a catastrophe. Rome, however, did not give up. This was one of the decisive reasons for Rome's later success. The Romans were able to endure enormous losses, raise new troops, and largely keep their alliances together in Italy. Hannibal hoped that many of Rome's Italian allies would defect to him. Some did, but most remained loyal to Rome or were bound by Roman strength. So Hannibal could win battles, but not decide the war. Rome changed its strategy. Instead of repeatedly confronting Hannibal in open battles, it weakened Carthage's power in other places. Roman troops fought in Spain, interrupted supply routes, and finally attacked North Africa. The decisive Roman general was Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Africanus. He brought the war to Africa and forced Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy. In 202 BC, the Battle of Zama took place. There Scipio defeated Hannibal. Carthage had to give up its fleet, make high payments, and was no longer allowed to wage war without Roman approval. This broke Carthage as a great power. Rome, on the other hand, was now the strongest power in the Western Mediterranean. Nevertheless, the fear of Carthage remained in Rome. Decades later, some Roman politicians, especially Cato the Elder, called for the final destruction of the city. The Third Punic War began in 149 BC. Carthage was no longer a real threat to Rome at this point, but Rome wanted to rule out any possibility of a resurgence. After a long siege, Carthage was conquered and destroyed in 146 BC. Many inhabitants were killed or enslaved. The area became the Roman province of Africa. In the same year, 146 BC, Rome finally subjugated Greece as well. The city of Corinth was destroyed, and the Greek world came under Roman control. This year is symbolic of Rome's transition to the dominant power of the Mediterranean. Rome had not only defeated Carthage, but also subdued the ancient Greek powers. An Italian republic had become a world power. But this rise brought new problems. The Roman Republic was originally created for a city and its Italian system of alliances. Now it had to administer provinces, collect tributes, rule foreign peoples, lead large armies, and control huge amounts of wealth. The old institutions were only suitable to a limited extent for this. The Senate gained enormous importance in foreign policy, but corruption, abuse of power, and competition increased. The provinces were administered by Roman governors. Some acted responsibly, others used their position for personal enrichment. Taxes were often collected by private tax tenants who wanted to make high profits. For many provincial inhabitants, Roman rule therefore meant exploitation, taxes, and dependence. At the same time, Rome brought roads, administration, trade, and later also legal structures. So Roman rule was not the same everywhere, but it was always associated with power and control. In Italy, too, the rise to world power changed society. The wars had burdened many farmers. Citizen farmers had to do military service for a long time and could not cultivate their fields. Some lost their land to rich landowners. They built large estates, so-called latifundia, on which slaves often worked. The number of slaves increased sharply as a result of the wars of conquest. Prisoners of war were sold and worked in households, mines, workshops, or in fields. This endangered the old basis of the Republic, the free peasant, who was both a soldier and a citizen. When more and more peasants became impoverished and moved to Rome, a propertyless population grew there. At the same time, the rich families became even richer. They profited from the spoils of war, provincial administration, trade, and land ownership. Social inequality increased sharply. The military also changed. Rome's expansion demanded ever longer campaigns in far-flung areas. Traditional citizen service was less and less suited to the requirements of a world empire. Soldiers were on the road for months or years. Commanders were able to gain the fame, wealth, and loyalty of their troops through successful wars. This was to become dangerous later, because the soldiers' bond with their commanders became stronger and stronger. After the Punic Wars, Rome also waged wars in the east. It intervened in the conflicts of the Hellenistic kingdoms, defeated Macedonia, placed Asia Minor under influence, and became the decisive arbiter in the eastern Mediterranean. In the beginning, Rome often acted as the liberator of Greek cities. But over time it became clear that Roman freedom usually meant Roman control. The Hellenistic world was gradually integrated into the Roman sphere of influence. Rome's success was based on several factors. First, the Republic had a strong alliance system in Italy. Defeated peoples were often not completely destroyed, but integrated in different ways. This allowed Rome to fall back on large numbers of soldiers. Secondly, Rome was amazingly persevering. Even after heavy defeats, it continued to fight. Third, Rome was adaptable. It learned naval warfare, adopted foreign techniques, and adapted its strategies. But it is precisely these strengths that create new tensions. The wealth from the conquests changed values and ways of life. Many Romans complained of luxury, bribery, and moral decay. Competition for office became fiercer because political careers now offered access to enormous wealth and fame. Triumphal processions, booty and clientele networks strengthened individual political families. The Republic formally remained, but its internal balance began to falter. Rome's rise to world power was therefore not an easy triumphal procession. It was associated with brutal wars, destroyed cities, enslaved people, and growing inequality. At the same time, he laid the foundations of an empire that would connect the Mediterranean region politically, economically, and culturally. Rome became the central power of a world that included Greeks, Carthaginians, Iberians, Gauls, Egyptians, Syrians, and many other peoples. For the Romans themselves, a crucial question now arose. Could a republic that had arisen for a city on the Tiber rule a world empire? The following decades were to show that this question was becoming increasingly difficult to answer. Expansion had made Rome great, but it had also shaken the social and political foundations of the Republic. The next chapter is therefore about the crisis and the end of the Roman Republic. Attempts at reform, power struggles, civil wars, and extraordinary personalities such as the Gracchi, Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, and Augustus were to fundamentally change Rome. The Republic, which once abhorred kings, eventually gave rise to a new form of autocracy, the Empire. Chapter 13: Crisis and End of the Roman Republic. When Rome had become the dominant power of the Mediterranean, the Republic seemed to be at the height of its strength. Carthage was destroyed, Greece was subjugated, Macedonia was defeated, and large parts of the western and eastern Mediterranean were under Roman influence. But it was precisely this success that became a problem for Rome. The Republic had originally emerged from a city community. Their offices, rules, and traditions had been created for a city-state and its Italian alliances. But now Rome had to administer a world empire. This task gradually overwhelmed the old structures. The conquests had brought immense wealth to Rome. Commanders returned with booty, nobles enriched themselves in the provinces, merchants and tax tenants earned large sums of money. At the same time, social inequality intensified. Many small peasants, who had previously formed the backbone of the Roman army, were in need. They had to do military service for a long time and could not cultivate their fields. Some got into debt, others sold their land to rich landowners. They built huge estates, so-called latifundia, on which slaves often worked. The number of slaves had increased sharply as a result of the wars. Prisoners of war were brought to Italy in large quantities and sold at markets. For rich Romans, they were cheap labor. For free peasants, they became competition. This resulted in a dangerous development. The property became richer, many ordinary citizens became impoverished, and in Rome a large urban mass of people grew who had hardly any possessions and few prospects. This also endangered the military basis of the Republic, because the traditional soldier was actually a citizen with his own country. In this situation, politicians appeared who demanded reforms. The brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus became particularly well known. Tiberius Gracchus became tribune of the people in 133 BC. He wanted to redistribute public land used by rich landowners and thus give impoverished citizens an economic basis again. His goal was not to destroy the Republic, but to save it. But many senators saw their interests threatened. The conflict escalated, and Tiberius was slain with many of his followers. A few years later, his brother Gaius Gracchus attempted further reforms. He wanted to improve the supply of the citizens, found colonies, limit the power of the Senate, and also give the Italian allies more rights. He also met with fierce resistance. In the end, Gaius was also killed. The Gracchi showed that political conflicts in Rome were no longer resolved only by debates and votes, but increasingly by violence. This was a dangerous break with the traditions of the Republic. Another problem was the relationship with the Italian allies. Many peoples of Italy had provided Rome with soldiers for a long time and participated in its wars. But they did not have the same rights as Roman citizens. They carry burdens without being involved in politics to the same extent. When their demands for citizenship were rejected, the War of the Allies broke out from 91 to 88 BC. This war shook Italy severely. In the end, Rome granted citizenship to most of the Italian allies. This considerably expanded the Roman citizenry, but the crisis of the Republic was not solved. At the same time, the army changed. The general Marius played a central role in this. He reformed the army by accepting dispossessed citizens as soldiers. These men received equipment, pay, and the hope of land after service. This made the army more efficient and professional, but had a dangerous side effect. The soldiers felt more and more obliged to their commander, who promised them booty and supplies, and less to the state as an abstract republic. This created a new source of political power. Anyone who commanded a successful army could exert pressure on the Senate or even march against Rome. This is exactly what happened to Sulla. Sulla was an aristocratic general and political opponent of the followers of Marius. When an important supreme command was to be withdrawn from him, he did something unheard of. He marched on Rome with his legions. This crossed a line that was disastrous for the Republic. Roman soldiers no longer fought only against external enemies, but against other Romans. Sulla won the power struggle, had opponents persecuted, and published so-called proscription lists. Anyone on these lists could be killed, and their property was confiscated. Fear, revenge, and enrichment were combined. Sulla then had himself appointed dictator and tried to strengthen the power of the Senate and weaken the tribunes of the people. He wanted to stabilize the Republic in the aristocratic sense. But although he later resigned voluntarily, he had set a dangerous example. The political order of Rome could be reshaped by force and military power. After Sulla, the Republic remained internally weakened. New strong men came to the fore. One of them was Pompey. He gained fame through military successes, including against pirates and in the east against Mithridates of Pontus. Another was Crassus, one of the richest men in Rome, who became known for his suppression of the slave revolt under Spartacus. The Spartacus revolt of 73 to 71 BC had shown how dangerous the tensions of a slave society could become. Thousands of slaves had risen and at times greatly disturbed Rome. The third and finally most important man was Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar came from an old, but at times politically weakened noble family. He was ambitious, intelligent, charismatic, and willing to take big risks. To further his political career, he joined forces with Pompey and Crassus. This alliance is called the First Triumvirate. It was not an official constitutional body, but a private power agreement between three influential men. Each of them had their own goals, but together they were able to put pressure on the Senate. Caesar was given the supreme command in Gaul. There he waged a series of wars from 58 to 50 BC, through which large areas came under Roman control. His reports on the Gallic War presented his deeds as necessary and successful. For Caesar, the campaigns brought fame, fortune, and the loyalty of his soldiers. This is exactly what made him dangerous for his opponents in Rome. They feared that he could threaten the Republic with his military power. After the death of Crassus, the balance between Caesar and Pompey was broken. Pompey approached the Senate, while Caesar came under pressure. His opponents wanted him to resign his command and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar knew that charges and political ruin could await him there. In 49 BC, he crossed the Rubicon River, the border between his province and Italy, with his troops. This began a civil war. The phrase "the die is cast" was later associated with this moment. Caesar defeated Pompey and his followers in several campaigns. Pompey fled to Egypt and was murdered there. Caesar continued to persecute his opponents, put things in order in Egypt, where Cleopatra VII played an important role, and finally returned to Rome as the most powerful man. He had himself appointed dictator, and finally even dictator for life. He carried out reforms, granted civil rights, founded colonies, rearranged the calendar, and tried to improve the administration of the empire. But for many senators, his power appeared to be a return to royal rule. Hatred of royalty was deeply rooted in Roman political culture. Even if Caesar did not officially call himself king, his position seemed like a monarchy to many. A group of conspirators around Brutus and Cassius decided to kill him in order to save the freedom of the Republic. On March 15, 44 BC, the Ides of March, Caesar was assassinated in the Senate. The conspirators believed that Caesar's death could restore the Republic. But the opposite happened. There was no clear plan for the time after that. Caesar's supporters mobilized the people and the veterans. In particular, Mark Antony, a close confidant of Caesar, gained influence. At the same time, Caesar's adopted son and heir Octavian, the later Augustus, appeared. Although he was young, he showed remarkable political coldness, patience, and determination. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus formed the second triumvirate. Unlike the first, it was officially vested with extraordinary powers. Again, there were proscriptions. Opponents were persecuted, including the famous orator Cicero, who had sharply attacked Antony. The Caesar murderers Brutus and Cassius were defeated at Philippi in 42 BC. After that, the victors divided power among themselves. But even this alliance could not last permanently. Lepidus was soon eliminated. The rivalry grew between Octavian in the west and Antony in the east. Antony was politically and personally associated with Cleopatra VII of Egypt. Octavian cleverly used this for propaganda. He portrayed Antony as a man who had betrayed Roman values and was under the influence of a foreign queen. The conflict was thus presented not only as a power struggle between Romans, but as Rome's struggle against an Oriental threat. In 31 BC, the decisive Battle of Actium took place. Octavian's fleet, led by Agrippa, defeated Antony and Cleopatra. A year later, Antony and Cleopatra took their own lives. Egypt became a Roman province, and Octavian remained as the sole ruler. This ended the long phase of civil wars. The Republic still existed formally, but its political reality had changed fundamentally. Octavian was smarter than Caesar on the question of staging power. He did not call himself king and avoided the impression of an open monarchy. Instead, he presented himself as the restorer of the Republic. In 27 BC, he was given the honorary name Augustus. He retained central means of power, command of important provinces and armies, great influence over the Senate, religious prestige, and enormous personal authority. Outwardly, many republican forms remained, but in fact the decisive power lay with Augustus. The Roman Republic did not end in a single day. It broke down over generations. Social inequality, military changes, ambitious generals, weak institutions, violence in politics, and the challenges of a world empire undermined its foundations. The Republic had become great through expansion, but it was precisely this expansion that had unleashed forces that it could no longer control. The end of the Republic is therefore a story full of contradictions. Many acted in the name of freedom, but strengthened violence and personal power. Reforms were supposed to save order, but led to new conflicts. Generals supposedly defended the state, but marched against Rome. Caesar was murdered to preserve the Republic, but his death accelerated the transition to autocracy. Augustus marked the beginning of a new era. Rome remained powerful, perhaps more powerful than ever before. The civil wars ended, order returned, and the empire was stabilized. But the price was high. The political freedom of the old republic gave way to a new form of rule. The republic became the empire. In the next chapter, we will take a closer look at this Roman Empire. We see how Augustus and his successors ruled a huge empire, how the Pax Romana came into being, how cities, roads, law, and administration functioned, and what life was like in this world empire. Chapter 14: The Roman Empire. Augustus marked the beginning of a new era in Roman history. After decades of civil wars, power struggles, and political violence, many people longed for order and security. The Republic had still formally existed, but its internal foundations had been broken. Too many generals had fought for power with their own armies, too many political conflicts had been decided by force, and the empire was now too large to be governed like a city community. Augustus understood this situation better than Caesar. He did not establish an open royal rule, but retained many republican forms on the outside. In reality, however, the decisive power now lay with him. Augustus did not call himself king. This title was hated in Rome. Instead, he allowed himself to be portrayed as the first citizen of the state, as a princeps. This is why the early imperial period is also referred to as the Principalate. The Senate remained, consuls continued to be elected, popular assemblies did not disappear immediately, and old offices continued to exist. But Augustus controlled the most important means of power: the army, the finances, central provinces, and the political direction of the state. He combined various powers in his person without openly presenting himself as an autocrat. This new order brought stability. After a long period of uncertainty, many inhabitants of the empire were able to adjust to peace, administration, and economic development. The period that began with Augustus and spanned the first centuries of the imperial period is often referred to as Pax Romana, i.e. Roman peace. This does not mean that there were no more wars. Fighting continued on the borders, uprisings were suppressed, and emperors waged campaigns. But in the interior of the Mediterranean region, a comparatively stable order prevailed for a long time. Piracy was fought, roads were expanded, trade increased, and many cities experienced prosperity. The Roman Empire was huge. In the course of its greatest expansion, it encompassed areas from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, from North Africa to the Danube and Rhine. In this empire lived countless peoples with different languages, religions, and traditions. Rome did not rule a unified nation in the modern sense, but an empire. The art was to control this diversity and at the same time make it usable. An important means of achieving this was the provincial administration. The conquered territories were divided into provinces. Some were under the direct control of the emperor, especially where many troops were stationed. Others were administered by the Senate. Governors represented the Roman power locally, ensured tax revenues, jurisdiction, and order. In doing so, they often collaborated with local elites. Rome did not impose complete cultural assimilation everywhere. It often allowed existing cities, sanctuaries, and traditions to continue as long as taxes were paid, peace prevailed, and Roman supremacy was recognized. It was precisely this cooperation with local elites that was one of the Reich's strengths. Anyone who was rich and influential in a province could benefit from Rome. Local upper classes were given offices, honorary rights, and sometimes Roman citizenship. They financed public buildings, baths, temples, theaters, or streets, and presented themselves as benefactors of their cities. In this way, Roman rule was carried not only by soldiers, but also by people who had an interest in being part of the system. Roman citizenship played a special role in this. In the early Republic, it had been the right of the citizens of Rome. But over the centuries, it has been expanded more and more. First on Italian allies, later on many individuals and whole communities in the provinces. Citizenship brought legal advantages, social advancement, and prestige. In 212 AD, Emperor Caracalla finally granted Roman citizenship to almost all free inhabitants of the empire. This shows how much Rome had evolved from a city to an empire with a common legal identity. Another reason for the stability of the empire was the army. The Roman legions were mainly on the borders, on the Rhine, on the Danube in Britain, in the east against the Parthians and later the Sassanids, in North Africa and other strategic regions. The legionnaires were professional soldiers, well-trained and organized. In addition to the legions, there were auxiliary troops, often from the provinces. After their service, these soldiers were able to obtain civil rights and land. Thus, the military connected people from different parts of the empire to Rome. The army was a protecting power, but also a political factor. As long as emperors had the loyalty of the troops, their rule was more secure. If they lost that loyalty, it became dangerous. Many emperors were raised or overthrown by soldiers. Even in the early imperial period, It became clear that the army was not only a tool of the state, but could also exercise power itself. Nevertheless, the army remained one of the most important foundations of the empire's stability for a long time. Everyday life in the Roman Empire varied greatly depending on whether you lived in Rome, in a provincial town, on a country estate, in a military camp, or in a village. The city of Rome itself was a metropolis of enormous size. Hundreds of thousands of people lived there. The city was full of temples, markets, tenement houses, villas, spas, theaters, and public squares. The Roman Forum remained a symbolic center, but the emperors built new forums, palaces, and monuments to make their power visible. Life in Rome could be impressive, but also hard. Rich families lived in large houses with courtyards and servants. Many poor people, on the other hand, lived in cramped apartment buildings, the so-called insulae. These buildings were often poorly built, at risk of fire and overcrowded. Fire, disease, noise, and poverty were part of the everyday life of many city dwellers. To prevent social unrest, emperors provided grain supplies, games, and public entertainment. The expression bread and circuses describes this policy, even if it simplifies reality. One of the most famous places of Roman entertainment was the Colosseum, which was built under the Flavians. Gladiator fights, animal hunts, and other spectacles took place there. For today's people, these events seem brutal, but for many Romans they were part of public culture, political self-expression, and social order. The emperor or rich organizers showed generosity, the people received entertainment, and the power over life and death was visibly staged. In addition to such spectacles, thermal baths played a major role. Bathing facilities were places of personal hygiene, recreation, and encounters. People met there, had conversations, did business, or spent their free time. Roman baths, theaters, amphitheaters, temples, and administrative buildings were built in many cities of the empire. They made the Roman way of life visible. This spread of Roman forms is often called Romanization, but it did not mean the same thing everywhere. In many regions, Roman and local traditions mixed. Trade benefited greatly from the reunification of the empire. Roads, ports, and safe sea routes connected the provinces. Grain came from Egypt, metals and olive oil from Spain, wine and handicrafts from Gaul, grain and oil from North Africa, luxury goods, spices, and silk from the east via long trade chains. Coins facilitated exchange, and Roman law created some security for contracts and property. The Mediterranean Sea was sometimes referred to by the Romans as Mare Nostrum, our sea. It was the unifying center of the empire. Roman law is one of the most enduring achievements of antiquity. Even in the Republic, Rome had developed a strong legal tradition. In the imperial era, the law was further expanded, commented on, and applied. It regulated property, contracts, family, inheritance, civil rights, and many questions of public life. Of course, this right was not the same for everyone. Slaves had no freedom, women were legally restricted, and social differences played a major role. Nevertheless, Roman legal thought later became an important basis for European legal traditions. Religion was diverse in the empire. The traditional Roman gods continued to be worshipped, as were local deities in the provinces. Many cults mixed. Isis from Egypt, Mithras from the east, or Cybele from Asia Minor found followers in different parts of the empire. The cult of the emperor was also important. The worship of the emperor or his divine protection was an expression of political loyalty. It was supposed to symbolically hold the empire together. It was in this religious environment that Christianity also emerged and spread. At first, it was a small Jewish movement in the eastern Mediterranean. In the course of the imperial period, it spread over cities, trade routes, and communities. The Christians worshipped only one god and rejected sacrifices for other gods and the cult of the emperor. From a Roman point of view, this could make them suspicious because religion and political loyalty were closely linked. At times there were persecutions, but Christianity continued to grow. Its importance was to become particularly decisive in late antiquity. The emperors themselves were very different. Augustus founded the order. Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius and Nero belonged to the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Some emperors ruled cautiously, others eccentrically or violently. After crises and changes of power, new dynasties followed. The 2nd century AD in particular is often considered a phase of great stability, especially under emperors such as Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Trajan led the empire to its greatest extent. Hadrian focused more on securing the borders and had Hadrian's Wall built in Britain, for example. Marcus Aurelius later became known as the philosopher emperor, but had to fight on the borders for many years. Despite all its stability, the empire was never free of problems. Its size made it difficult to govern. Borders had to be defended, troops paid, taxes collected, and power struggles controlled. When an emperor died, the succession was not always clear. Adoption, succession, Senate recognition, and military support played changing roles. Again and again there were civil wars or short reigns. The question of who was allowed to become emperor remained a weak point of the system. There were also economic tensions. The supply of the cities, the financing of the army, the tax burden of the provinces, and the dependence on slave labor posed long-term challenges. In some regions, trade flourished. In others, people suffered from taxes, war, or exploitation. The empire brought order and infrastructure, but it was also based on domination, inequality, and coercion. Nevertheless, the Roman Empire was one of the most formative political orders in history. It connected the Mediterranean region for centuries. Its streets, cities, legal concepts, administration, language, and culture left deep traces. Latin became the basis of later Romance languages in the West. Greek remained important in the East. Roman architecture influenced later centuries. Terms such as emperor, senate, province, legion, or citizenship still have an effect today. The empire was therefore more than a succession of rulers. It was a huge system of power, administration, military, law, trade, cities, and symbols. It created peace and order, but also dependence and oppression. It enabled cultural exchange, but demanded political subordination. It was admirable in its organization and at the same time brutal in its implementation. In the next and last chapter, we turn to late antiquity. There, the Roman Empire changes fundamentally. New religions, internal crises, external threats, divisions of empires, and migratory movements lead to the ancient world slowly transitioning into a new epoch. Antiquity does not end suddenly, but it transforms. Step by step, the world of the Middle Ages emerged from the Roman Empire. Chapter 15, Late Antiquity and the End of Antiquity. The end of antiquity was not a single moment when one world suddenly disappeared and a new one began. There was not a day when people woke up and knew, now antiquity is over. Rather, it was a long process of change. The Roman Empire, which had shaped the Mediterranean region for centuries, changed slowly and profoundly. Political structures changed, new religions gained in importance, cities lost some of their old role, new powers emerged, and the boundaries between the Roman and non-Roman worlds became increasingly permeable. We call this transitional period Late Antiquity. Late Antiquity begins around the 3rd century AD. During this time, the Roman Empire fell into a serious crisis. For decades, the emperors changed in quick succession. Many were raised by the army and overthrown again. Civil wars, external attacks, economic problems, and epidemics weakened the empire. It was particularly dangerous that different border regions were under pressure at the same time. Germanic groups invaded the Rhine and Danube. The new Persian Sassanid Empire became a strong opponent in the east, and rival emperors fought for power inside. This crisis showed that the empire had become too large and too complex to be governed permanently from a single center. The army devoured enormous resources, the administration became more cumbersome, and the tax burden increased. At the same time, however, the empire remained surprisingly resilient. It did not collapse in the 3rd century, but was reformed. It is precisely this ability to adapt that is an important feature of late antiquity. Emperor Diocletian, who ruled from 284 AD, played a central role. He realized that a single emperor could hardly solve all the problems of the empire at the same time. Therefore, he introduced the tetrarchy, i.e., a rule of 4 emperors. 2 higher-ranking Augusti and 2 lower-ranking Caesars were to administer different parts of the empire and jointly ensure stability. The idea behind it was clear: the Reich should be able to react more quickly, especially at the borders. In addition, the succession was to be arranged so that new civil wars did not break out every time. Diocletian also reformed the administration, taxes, and military. The provinces were downsized, bureaucracy expanded, and control over the population strengthened. As a result, the empire became more organized, but also more burdensome for its inhabitants. People had to pay more taxes, professions were sometimes more closely tied to families, and the state intervened more deeply in economic life. Late antiquity was therefore not simply a time of decline, but also a time of stronger state order. After Diocletian, Constantine the Great became the decisive figure. He prevailed in new power struggles and became autocrat. His relationship to Christianity was particularly important. In the first centuries after Christ, Christianity was initially a persecuted or at least viewed with suspicion. Christians rejected sacrifices for the traditional gods and the cult of the emperor, which from the Roman point of view could be seen as a lack of loyalty. But despite persecution, Christianity had continued to spread, especially in cities and along trade routes. Constantine changed the situation fundamentally. In the early 4th century, he granted Christians religious freedom and increasingly promoted the church. This did not mean that the empire immediately became fully Christian. Traditional cults persisted, and many people clung to old religious practices. But the direction was clear. Christianity went from being a temporarily persecuted minority to a recognized and ultimately preferred religion. Constantine also intervened in inner Christian disputes. At the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, attempts were made to clarify central questions of faith and to establish unity in the Church. This shows how closely religion and politics were now connected. For the emperor, religious unity was also a question of state stability. Disputes within the Church could appear to be a danger to the order of the empire. Another important decision of Constantine was the establishment of a new capital in the east, Constantinople. The city was built on the site of ancient Byzantium and was strategically located between Europe and Asia, at the transition from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. Constantinople became rich, strongly fortified, and politically important. While the city of Rome remained symbolically important in the West, the center of power increasingly shifted to the East. This development was to be decisive for the rest of the story. In the late 4th century, Christianity finally became the dominant religion of the empire. Under Emperor Theodosius I, traditional cults were increasingly restricted, and Christianity was given a primacy position. This profoundly changed the intellectual world of antiquity. Temples lost importance or were transformed, bishops gained political influence, and Christian ideas of salvation, sin, church, and history increasingly shaped people's thinking. At the same time, classical education did not simply disappear. Many Christian scholars were familiar with Greek philosophy, Roman literature, and ancient rhetoric. They did not reject everything old, but adopted, changed, and interpreted many things in a new way. Late antiquity was therefore a time of mixing. Roman administration, Greek education, Christian theology, and local traditions coexisted and influenced each other. Politically, the empire was increasingly divided. Several emperors had previously administered different regions, but after the death of Theodosius I in 395 AD, the division into a Western Empire and an Eastern Empire became permanent. This did not immediately mean a complete separation of two foreign states. Both parts of the empire continued to see themselves as Roman, but their development has been different. The East was economically stronger, had richer cities, and was better able to hold its own against attacks. The West was more affected by internal power struggles, weaker finances, and military pressure. During this time, so-called Germanic groups played an increasingly important role. However, terms such as Germanic peoples or migration of peoples can easily be misunderstood. They were not closed nations in the modern sense that simply invaded the empire as a whole. Rather, it was changing groups, associations, and warrior communities that moved, formed alliances, served in Rome, or fought against Rome. Many did not necessarily want to destroy the empire, but to gain land, security, recognition, or power in it. An important trigger for large movements was the pressure of the Huns in the late 4th century. Various groups, including Goths, sought shelter or new habitats within the Roman Empire. The admission of such groups was difficult. If care, treatment, or political agreements failed, violence could ensue. In 378, the Romans suffered a heavy defeat against the Goths in the Battle of Adrianople. Emperor Valens fell in battle. This event showed that Roman armies were no longer superior as a matter of course. In 410, Rome was sacked by the Visigoths under Alaric. For many contemporaries, this was a shock. The city of Rome had long since ceased to be the sole center of power of the empire, but it had enormous symbolic significance. The fact that Rome was taken by foreign warriors shook the self-image of many people. Christian authors such as Augustine tried to interpret this event. In his work The City of God, Augustine explained that no earthly kingdom is eternal and true hope cannot be based on political power. In the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire lost more and more control over its provinces. Germanic kingdoms arose in Gaul, Spain, and North Africa. The loss of North Africa to the Vandals was particularly serious because this region was economically important and provided grain and tax revenues. Without sufficient revenue, the West was able to finance its armies less and less. At the same time, military masters, i.e., powerful military leaders, often became more important than the emperors themselves. The Western Roman emperors of the 5th century were often weak and dependent on generals. Some were children, others puppets of powerful military officers. The actual power often lay with military commanders who commanded Roman and non-Roman troops. This shows how much the political order had changed. Rome still existed, but the old imperial authority was greatly weakened in the West. The traditional date for the end of the Western Roman Empire is the year 476 AD. In that year, the Germanic military leader Odoacer deposed the young Emperor Romulus Augustulus. Odoacer sent the imperial symbols of power to Constantinople and from then on ruled Italy himself as king. This event was later considered the end of the Western Roman Empire. For many contemporaries, it was perhaps less dramatic than it seems to us today. There was still administration, Roman elites, cities, taxes, and laws. But a separate Western Roman emperor no longer existed. In the East, on the other hand, the Roman Empire continued to exist. We often call it the Byzantine Empire today, but its inhabitants continued to see themselves as Romans. Constantinople remained a center of power, trade, education, and Christian culture. Especially under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, the Eastern Roman Empire even tried to reconquer parts of the West. In addition, Justinian had Roman law collected and arranged. This collection of laws, the Corpus Iuris Civilis, was later to become of great importance for Europe. The end of antiquity is therefore more complicated than a simple downfall. In the West, the Roman central power disintegrated, but many Roman structures lived on. The new kingdoms adopted Roman administration, Roman law, the Latin language, and the Christian religion. The church became an important institution that preserved education, literacy, and social order. In some cities, bishops took over tasks that had previously been performed by Roman officials. There was also no complete break culturally. Latin remained important in the West, Greek in the East. Ancient texts were copied, commented on, and preserved in Christian monasteries. Roman roads, walls, and cities continued to shape the landscape. Many people did not suddenly live differently just because an emperor was deposed. Nevertheless, the world changed. Long-distance trade declined in some regions, cities shrank, local rulers became more important, and political power was more strongly shaped by kings, warrior elites, and the church. So antiquity did not end with a single collapse, but with a transformation. New medieval empires emerged from the Roman Empire of the West. The ancient religious diversity became a Christian Europe. Roman provinces became dominions of Franks, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and other groups. At the same time, a Roman state remained in existence in the East, which continued the ancient tradition in its own way. If we look back at the entire history of antiquity, we see a huge arc. In the beginning, there were early advanced civilizations on large rivers, Mesopotamia and Egypt. This is where writing, cities, administration, and royalty were created. After that, empires developed in the Middle East, showing how power could be organized over large areas. In Greece, the polis emerged, and with it new forms of politics, philosophy, art, and science. Alexander the Great spread Greek culture far to the east and opened up the Hellenistic world. Finally, Rome united the Mediterranean region in an empire whose law, language, streets, and cities profoundly shaped the history of Europe. Late antiquity did not simply bring this world to an end, but transformed it. Old forms disappeared, others remained, new ones emerged. This is precisely why antiquity is so important to this day. It lives on not only in ruins, temples, and statues, but also in ideas, concepts, and institutions. Democracy, republic, law, philosophy, historiography, urban planning, literature, and religion. The history of antiquity is therefore not a distant, closed past. It is a foundation on which later centuries were built. Many questions that people asked at that time still concern us. How should power be limited? Who belongs to the political community? What is justice? Why do empires arise? And why do they perish? How do you preserve knowledge? And how does a world change when old certainties disappear? With the end of antiquity, a new epoch begins, the Middle Ages. But antiquity does not simply disappear. It remains as a reminder, a role model, a warning, and a legacy. Her story shows what people are capable of: great creativity, clever organization, impressive art, and deep thinking, but also war, oppression, and destruction. It is precisely this mixture that makes it so fascinating. And this is where our journey through the history of antiquity ends. From the first cities of Mesopotamia to the transformation of the Roman Empire, from the pyramids of Egypt to the democracy of Athens, from Alexander the Great to Augustus, from the Roman world power to the transition to the Middle Ages. Antiquity is gone, but its traces accompany us to this day.